The year is 1495, and a shadow is beginning to fall across Europe. Prepare to journey back in time, not to the glittering courts of kings or the bustling workshops of Renaissance masters, but to the very heart of a burgeoning medical crisis. Dim the lights, if you can, and let the soft hum of the world fade, for we are about to embark on a chilling expedition into one of history's most fearsome disease outbreaks, a mysterious and terrifying plague whose origins are debated to this day. You have just materialized in Europe in the vibrant yet tumultuous year of 1495. This is a world teetering precariously between the fading echoes of the Middle Ages and the dawn of a new era. The air, thick with the earthy scent of wood smoke, unwashed humanity, and the tang of distant seas, is a stark contrast to the fresh, sterilized environments you might be accustomed to. On the surface, the news is good. You've arrived in a time of unprecedented discovery, breathtaking art, and daring exploration. The Renaissance is blooming across Europe, fostering brilliant minds like Leonardo da Vinci, whose notebooks are already filled with audacious designs, and Michelangelo, whose marble will soon yield forms of divine beauty. Yet, beneath this veneer of cultural flourishing, a sinister undercurrent churns. You've landed precisely at the genesis of one of history's most terrifying disease outbreaks, a mysterious illness poised to unleash widespread terror across the continent. Your arrival finds you in Naples, a bustling Italian port city, in February 1495. The roar of celebration still echoes through its narrow, cobbled streets. King Charles VIII of France, with his formidable army, has just concluded a lengthy, brutal siege, capturing the city. French soldiers, alongside their motley collection of mercenaries, are reveling in their hard-won victory. They drink imported wines from goblets clutched in triumphant hands, carouse boisterously with local women, and bask in their moment of glory, oblivious to the silent, invisible menace brewing within their ranks. No one yet perceives the sinister seed that has been sown, an insidious threat that will soon cast its long, dark shadow across the whole of Europe. As you navigate the labyrinthine streets of Naples, teeming with victorious troops, you notice their sheer diversity. This is no homogeneous French force. Swiss pikemen, their disciplined ranks now somewhat loosened by celebration. German Landsknecht with their flamboyant, slashed doublets. Spanish swordsmen with their keen blades sheathed but ever present. And Italian crossbowmen, all mingle and jostle. Charles VIII's army, a moving city of some 50,000 men, has brought its entire retinue. Cooks tending smoky fires, servants scurrying with provisions, and prostitutes seeking their livelihood amidst the chaos. The military triumph has morphed into a week-long bacchanal, with wine flowing like water and traditional morals dissolving with each passing hour. Watch yourself around those soldiers, a local woman whispers, her voice raspy, as you pass her stall laden with freshly baked bread. They bring nothing but trouble. She spits on the ground for emphasis, a practiced gesture of warding off ill fortune, then quickly crosses herself, her eyes darting nervously towards a group of raucous Frenchmen. The Neapolitans are already weary of the occupying force, finding them crude, disrespectful, and insatiably demanding. For now, the soldiers appear healthy, their faces flushed with drink and triumph. But soon, for some, the first insidious signs will appear, strange sores that refuse to heal, followed by a telltale rash spreading across their bodies, an agonizing, bone-deep pain that gnaws from within, and eventually, for many, grotesque disfigurement and a slow, agonizing death. What is silently brewing here, in the festive chaos of occupied Naples, will soon be called the French disease by the Italians, a name that will morph into the Neapolitan disease, the Spanish disease, or the Polish disease in other countries, depending on who they wish to blame. This is the outbreak of what we now recognize as syphilis, though the name itself won't be coined until 1530 by the insightful Italian physician Girolamo Fracastoro. You have truly arrived at a pivotal, terrifying crossroads in medical history. For centuries to come, Scholars will fiercely debate the genesis of this scourge. Did Christopher Columbus and his crew unwittingly ferry this devastating disease back from the Americas in 1493, a sinister cargo hidden beneath the gold and spices? Or had it always lurked in Europe, perhaps in a milder, less virulent form? The scant archaeological evidence, such as skeleton 1216 unearthed at the Hull Friary site in England, hints at the disease's presence in Europe long before Columbus's fateful voyage, possibly as far back as the 1300s. But something profoundly has changed. Either a new, highly aggressive strain has emerged from the depths of some ancient microbial pool, or an older, milder ailment has mutated, transforming into something far more virulent and deadly, ready to unleash its fury. Seeking a respite from the chaotic streets, you decide to find lodging at a modest inn nestled near the bustling harbor. Here, the air is thick with the brine of the sea and the chatter of sailors and merchants exchanging exotic news from distant, often imagined, lands. The innkeeper, a stout man whose brow gleams perpetually with a sheen of sweat, greets you with a weary smile. He leads you to a small, private room. It is basic, even by the rudimentary standards of medieval accommodation. A simple straw mattress on a rough wooden frame, a small table holding a flickering candle, and a necessary chamber pot tucked away in the corner. Yet, it is relatively clean, which, as you quickly realize, isn't saying much. Food served below when the bell rings, he tells you, his voice low and conspiratorial. We've got fresh fish today, just brought in this morning. The French officers took most of it, but I managed to save some for my paying guests. He gives you a knowing wink, a silent acknowledgement of the ongoing tensions with the occupying forces. Later that evening, in the common room downstairs, a hubbub of voices and the clinking of tankards fill the air. You find yourself seated within earshot of a group of sailors, their faces tanned and weathered by sun and sea, who loudly claim to have sailed with Columbus on his groundbreaking voyages to the New World. They spin outrageous tall tales of their adventures, colossal sea monsters, islands populated by gold-clad natives, and storms that swallowed ships whole. Each story is more outlandish and improbable than the last, delivered with the theatrical flair of seasoned travelers. Then, one of them, a grizzled man with skin like dried leather and a disturbing gap where his front teeth should be, leans in closer, lowering his voice conspiratorially. There's something not right with some of the men who returned, he confides to his companions, his gaze sweeping the room before settling back on his ale. Pedro, who was with us on the first voyage, he's got these sores that won't heal. Started on his private parts, you know. He makes a crude, unambiguous gesture with his hand. Now they're spreading all over, and the pain in his bones keeps him awake at night, screaming like a demon's got him. The others nod solemnly, their boisterous laughter now replaced by a chilling silence. Another sailor, younger but equally hardened, adds his own grim anecdote. I've heard of others like that. They say it's because they lay with the native women there. You listen intently, a chill running down your spine, realizing you are hearing what might be the very first-hand accounts of this strange, new disease in Europe. Whether it truly originated in the Americas or was already a dormant threat on European soil, the connection to Columbus's voyages will, for better or worse, become indelibly etched in the popular imagination, fueling both fear and xenophobia. As the weeks bleed into months, a perceptible shift takes hold of Naples. The celebratory clamor of the French occupation gradually diminishes, replaced by an unsettling undercurrent of whispers and unease. Rumors circulate like a foul miasma through the taverns and marketplaces. A strange, terrifying affliction is spreading among the French troops. The initial symptoms, first described by the sailors, begin to manifest more widely. Soldiers are seen with painful, weeping sores, initially on their genitals, but then spreading insidiously across their bodies, like an angry rash. Terrible fevers rack their frames, and agonizing aches gnaw at their bones, intensified to unbearable levels under the cloak of night. The local doctors, steeped in the ancient, unyielding doctrines of Galen, are utterly baffled. Their traditional remedies, herbal poultices, bloodletting, and purgatives prove utterly useless against this unknown foe. By July 1495, the geopolitical landscape of Italy has also dramatically shifted. An alliance of formidable Italian princes, spearheaded by Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan, confronts Charles VIII's forces at the decisive Battle of Fornovo. Though a bloody and inconclusive affair in military terms, it achieves its strategic objective, forcing the French king to retreat from Italy. As Charles's vast army disperses, its soldiers, many of them now unwitting carriers of the mysterious disease, begin their long, arduous journeys home, scattering across the length and breadth of Europe. Each returning soldier, each mercenary making his way back to his homeland, inadvertently becomes a vector, sowing the seeds of a continent-wide epidemic with every step. Driven by a desire to witness the unfolding grandeur of the Renaissance, and perhaps to escape the growing dread of Naples, you decide to travel north to Rome, hoping to immerse yourself in the great works of art and architecture being created there. The journey is arduous, a true test of endurance. Medieval travel is a grueling affair, a far cry from modern comfort. It means walking for days, or perhaps riding a sturdy horse or a stubborn donkey along poorly maintained, often muddy roads, frequently little more than ancient tracks. The constant threat of bandits and highwaymen looms large, a very real danger in these fractured lands. For safety, you join a merchant caravan, a slow-moving procession of wagons and travelers, sleeping under the vast, indifferent expanse of the stars or in roadside inns of varying, often questionable, quality. As you journey northward, the whispers of the strange disease intensify and multiply. Everywhere you go, it seems to follow in the wake of returning soldiers, a grim, invisible companion trailing the retreating armies. Upon your arrival in Rome, the eternal city, you find it gripped by a palpable state of anxiety. Pope Alexander VI, the notorious and controversial Borgia Pope, whose court is already rife with intrigue and scandal, has issued dire warnings about the new disease. It has, in a terrifying testament to its indiscriminate nature, already begun to affect members of his own powerful court, striking down even the privileged and protected. In August 1495, just as the gravity of the epidemic truly begins to sink in, the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I issues a sweeping proclamation. He declares that nothing like this disease has ever been witnessed before in living memory, and, with the full authority of church and crown, he pronounces it a direct punishment from God for widespread blasphemy and sin. The religious authorities, ever eager to frame calamities within a moralistic context, are quick to capitalize on this narrative. They preach that the outbreak is divine retribution, a righteous scourge unleashed upon Europe for sinful behavior, particularly sexual impropriety, reinforcing the idea that illness is a consequence of moral failing. You witness the early, often clumsy attempts at implementing public health measures. Towns across the continent begin to isolate those displaying the telltale symptoms, sometimes in newly established, rudimentary hospices on the outskirts of communities. Yet, medieval medicine, rooted in ancient traditions and lacking any true understanding of contagion, has pathetically few effective treatments to offer. Physicians, trained rigorously in the Galenic tradition, cling to the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. They believe that disease is a result of an imbalance in these bodily fluids, and their treatments are designed to restore proper equilibrium through aggressive, often debilitating methods such as bloodletting, purging with powerful emetics and laxatives, and inducing profuse sweating therapies. For this terrifying new disease, various remedies, desperate and often harmful, are attempted. Some physicians, bewildered by its novelty, recommend mercury treatments, applied as caustic ointments or ingested internally, oblivious to the fact that mercury poisoning itself will often kill patients long before the disease might. The symptoms of mercury poisoning, excessive salivation, tremors, neurological damage, are tragically mistaken for the body expelling the disease. Other healers advocate for guaiacum, a resin imported from a New World tree, also known as holy wood. Their belief is rooted in a theological rather than scientific principle, that God, in His infinite wisdom, provides cures geographically near the source of diseases. The wealthy, desperate, and fearful seek out these expensive, often lethal, treatments, while the vast majority of the poor suffer without relief, their bodies ravaged and their spirits broken. In the bustling markets and public squares, you observe with growing dismay how swiftly fear and social stigma take root. Those with visible symptoms, the telltale sores, the telltale disfigurements, are immediately shunned, isolated, and treated as pariahs. People whisper behind cupped hands, their voices laced with judgment, that this is a disease of the immoral, the sexually deviant, those who have sinned most grievously against God. Yet, with a keen and unsettling clarity, you notice that it affects people from all walks of life, cutting across every social stratum, from the common prostitute scratching out a meager living, to the highest-ranking nobleman, from the grizzled soldier to the pious priest. The disease, it seems, cares nothing for status or sanctity. By the onset of winter, you have journeyed further north, making your way to Florence, the undisputed jewel of the Renaissance. Even in this city of unparalleled beauty and intellectual vibrancy, the dark shadow of the disease has fallen. You hear unsettling rumors that the brilliant young painter Sandro Botticelli, once celebrated for the joyful, sensual beauty of his earlier works like The Birth of Venus, has become deeply religious, almost fanatical. He is said to be profoundly influenced by the fiery sermons of Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar who preaches with terrifying conviction that the epidemic is God's direct punishment for Florence's sinful, worldly ways. The radiant sensuality of Botticelli's former masterpieces, you observe, is giving way to more somber, penitent religious themes, mirroring the city's collective angst. In Florence, through a stroke of luck and persistence, you manage to secure work as an assistant to a physician, Dr. Lorenzo Benivieni. He is a truly unusual figure among the doctors of his time, a beacon of emerging scientific thought in a profession largely shackled by tradition. Dr. Benivieni courageously performs autopsies, a practice still considered taboo and controversial by many, to understand the inner workings of the human body and, crucially, the precise effects of disease. This empirical, observational approach places him at the forefront of what will eventually become the scientific method, a revolutionary departure from relying solely on ancient texts. Working alongside him grants you a unique, invaluable perspective on how medical knowledge is painstakingly evolving in this period of crisis. This new disease, Dr. Benivieni tells you, his brow furrowed with a mixture of frustration and intellectual curiosity, as you help him meticulously prepare his array of crude instruments. It is unlike anything described in the ancient medical texts. Hippocrates never wrote of it, nor Galen. Either it is truly new to our world, a monstrous birth, or it has changed its very nature, mutating into something unrecognizable. He sighs heavily, a deep, weary sound. And our treatments, I fear, seem to offer little relief. The mercury itself causes terrible suffering, excessive salivation, the loss of teeth, debilitating tremors. Sometimes, I truly wonder if we are doing more harm than good. You assist him as he examines patients afflicted with the disease, a grim parade of suffering. The progression is truly terrible to witness, often leaving you feeling helpless and sickened. In its early stage, a small, usually painless sore, known as a chancre, appears, typically on the genitals. It often heals on its own, offering a cruel, false hope of recovery. Then, weeks or even months later, a widespread rash erupts, often covering the entire body, accompanied by raging fevers, debilitating fatigue, and excruciating aches. For some, the disease seems to vanish after this secondary stage, going dormant for years, a hidden viper within the body. But for many, especially in these brutal early years of the epidemic, it progresses relentlessly to a tertiary, third stage. This stage brings with it large, disfiguring sores that gnaw at the flesh, irreversible damage to the heart, brain, and bones, and, almost inevitably, a slow and agonizing death. The disease seems to follow a pattern, Dr. Benevieni observes, meticulously recording his findings in a ledger, 3 distinct stages, with periods of apparent recovery deceptively interspersed between them. It is most cunning, most treacherous. Through your invaluable work with the doctor, you gain a profound understanding of the complex social dimensions of the epidemic. The wealthy, armed with their money and influence, seek treatment in strict privacy, paying handsomely for the discretion that shields them from public shame and scrutiny. The poor, however, suffer publicly, their visible symptoms condemning them to banishment to the outskirts of towns, or to the crude, often neglected hospices. Religious authorities, clutching at familiar narratives, continue to preach moral purity as the ultimate prevention, while city governments, overwhelmed and under-equipped, struggle valiantly, but largely in vain, to contain the inexorable spread. As spring graces the landscape in 1496, news, carried by weary travelers and anxious merchants, reaches Florence. The disease has now spread relentlessly, reaching as far as the German territories, into the heart of France, across the rugged mountains of Switzerland, and into the lowlands of Holland. It follows the well-worn trade routes, clinging to the paths of merchants, soldiers, and sailors, a silent, invisible passenger. No corner of Europe, it seems, is truly safe from its relentless reach. In the vibrant, clamorous markets of Florence, where the scent of spices mingles with the earthy smell of wool and the murmur of 1,000 voices, you overhear conversations about the disease. Everyone, it seems, has a theory about its mysterious origins and its sinister nature. It came from the New World, insists a portly spice merchant, gesturing emphatically with a bag of peppercorns. Columbus's men brought it back with them, a curse from savage lands. Nonsense, counters a grizzled wool trader, shaking his head vehemently. It's a corruption of leprosy, made more virulent by an unfavorable alignment of the planets, especially Saturn, casting its dark influence. It's the Jews, whispers another, a gaunt, shifty-eyed man, looking furtively around before crossing himself. They brought it when they were expelled from Spain. God's judgment, I tell you. You recognize, with a chilling clarity, how swiftly fear breeds superstition and, more dangerously, scapegoating. The deeply ingrained human tendency to blame the other, foreigners, enemies, or marginalized groups, is as infectious and as pervasive as the disease itself, poisoning the very fabric of society. The year 1497 brings further grim tidings. The epidemic has now crossed the narrow seas, reaching the shores of Britain and the wild highlands of Scotland. By this point, physicians across Europe, forced by the sheer scale of the crisis to confront the unknown, are documenting the disease with increasing, albeit still incomplete, accuracy. In 1498, Joseph Grunpeck, a German scholar, publishes one of the first truly detailed descriptions of the affliction. He writes, with a vivid horror that resonates through the centuries, that the disease is so cruel, so distressing, so appalling that until now, nothing so horrifying, nothing more terrible or disgusting has ever been known on this earth. Your work with Dr. Benevieni has provided you with invaluable insights into the dynamic, often painful, process of how medical knowledge evolves in response to unprecedented challenges. This relentless epidemic, tearing through the continent, is forcing physicians to question ancient authorities, the hallowed wisdom of Hippocrates and Galen, and, instead, to trust their own empirical observations, their own direct experiences with the sick. You are witnessing, in these dark and uncertain times, the very early stirrings of what will eventually blossom into the scientific revolution, a paradigm shift that will fundamentally alter humanity's understanding of the natural world and its afflictions. By 1499, a mere 4 years after its initial devastating appearance in Naples, the disease has become fearfully endemic across Europe. Reports suggest it has now reached the frozen fjords of Scandinavia, the vast plains of Hungary, the ancient lands of Greece, the forests of Poland, and the sprawling territories of Russia. European voyages, ever pushing the boundaries of the known world, have inadvertently carried it as far as Kolkata in India. It seems, with a terrifying inevitability, that no place on Earth remains untouched by its insidious spread. During your extended sojourn through Renaissance Europe, you've keenly observed the differential impact of this new disease on various communities. In the bustling, cosmopolitan port cities like Naples and Venice, where sailors, merchants, and prostitutes mix freely in a vibrant, often uninhibited confluence of cultures, the spread is terrifyingly rapid and widespread. In contrast, in the more isolated rural villages, the disease might arrive more slowly, perhaps carried by a single returning soldier or an itinerant merchant, then gradually, inexorably, work its way through families and close-knit neighbors, one life at a time. The pervasive fear of the disease begins to subtly, yet profoundly, alter social behaviors. There is a palpable increase in suspicion towards strangers, a marked decrease in the traditional hospitality once extended to weary travelers. Sexual mores, at least publicly, tighten considerably, enforced by both religious condemnation and pragmatic fear. Yet, you observe with a cynical resignation, human nature remains stubbornly constant. Despite the visible horrors and the unspoken risks, people continue to seek pleasure, connection, and intimacy, even knowing the potential, devastating cost. In the sweltering summer of 1500, 5 years after the first major outbreak in Naples, you find yourself in Venice, that magnificent, improbable city of canals and commerce, shimmering like a mirage on the lagoon. The Republic of Venice, ever pragmatic and forward-thinking, has instituted some of Europe's most advanced and systematic public health measures. The Venetian Senate, known for its shrewd governance, has appointed dedicated health magistrates, the Provveditori alla Sanità, who possess sweeping powers. They meticulously inspect arriving ships, impose strict quarantines, a practice that gave us the very word quarantine, from the Venetian quarantina, meaning 40 days, and even attempt to regulate prostitution in their concerted efforts to control the relentless spread of disease. Standing on the iconic Rialto Bridge, watching the elegant gondolas glide silently beneath you, their dark forms contrasting with the shimmering water, you reflect on the extraordinary panorama of human experience you have witnessed. A continent transformed, not merely by the ravages of a disease, but by its multifaceted, often contradictory, response to that disease. You've seen how the epidemic has profoundly influenced art, shaping its themes and aesthetics, how it has polarized religious belief, fueling both fervent piety and dark superstition, how it has spurred the hesitant evolution of medicine, and how it has irrevocably altered social structures. You've observed both the worst of human nature, the paralyzing fear, the cruel blame, the dehumanizing stigmatization, and, crucially, the best, the quiet courage of healers like Dr. Benevieni, the solidarity that binds communities in crisis, and the indomitable resilience of the human spirit. As night gently falls over the Venetian lagoon, painting the sky in hues of deep violet and indigo, the lamplighters move through the labyrinthine alleys and across the hundreds of bridges, bringing flickering points of brightness to the gathering darkness. This, you muse, is an apt and poignant metaphor for the human response to any calamity. The stubborn, desperate determination to create light, to find understanding amidst confusion, to forge ahead with a flicker of hope, even in the most frightening and uncertain circumstances. And so, you settle in for the night in your rented room, overlooking a small, sleepy canal, listening to the gentle lapping of water against ancient stone, pondering what the coming years will bring. Europe continues to grapple with this mysterious and frightening disease, blissfully unaware that it will remain a scourge for centuries to come, shaping history in ways both subtle and profound. a constant reminder of humanity's vulnerability and its enduring strength. The morning light filters softly through the intricately carved wooden shutters of your Venetian room, casting shimmering patterns on the ceiling as it dances on the water reflected from the small canal below. You have now spent several months observing this merchant republic, a truly sophisticated city, as it mobilizes its formidable resources to respond to the epidemic. Venice, you've learned, possesses centuries of invaluable experience in confronting infectious diseases, particularly the devastating plague, which has periodically ravaged Europe. The city, ever ahead of its time, established its first permanent health magistrate, the Magistrato alla Sanità, as far back as 1486, a full decade before this terrifying new disease even emerged. The Venetian approach to public health is impressively systematic, almost clinical in its precision. Ships arriving at the bustling port, laden with exotic goods and weary travelers, must display a meticulously documented clean bill of health. Those without it, or those arriving from suspected regions, are compelled to remain isolated at anchor for the full duration of quarantina, 40 days, a rigorous practice that would eventually give the world the word quarantine. The city also maintains a lazaretto, a specialized isolation hospital strategically located on a separate island, allowing the infected to be treated far away from the general population, a harsh but undeniably effective system. Yet, even Venice's advanced public health measures, impressive as they are, cannot fully contain the French disease, as many still stubbornly call it. The city's famous courtesans, the cortigini onest, high-class prostitutes who are often educated, artistic women moving in elite social circles, have been particularly hard hit. They suffer not only from the ravages of the disease itself, but also from the burgeoning new regulations designed to control its spread. You have become acquainted with Veronica Franco, a young courtesan of striking beauty and intellect, who is also a published poet, a rarity in her profession. Unlike the common streetwalkers or brothel prostitutes, courtesans like Veronica entertain wealthy merchants, powerful senators, and noblemen in elegant, privately appointed apartments. They offer not only physical companionship, but also intellectual conversation, witty banter, and artistic performances, often playing lutes or reciting poetry. The Senate has imposed harsh new restrictions, Veronica tells you, her voice tinged with a weariness that belies her youth, as you sip chilled wine on her private balcony overlooking the shimmering Grand Canal. We must now register with the health office and submit to regular examinations. Those found with the disease are sent to the lazaretto or, worse, expelled from the city entirely. She sighs, a fragile sound, and sets down her exquisite Murano glass. Many of my sisters in the profession have simply disappeared, dead, isolated, or fled to other cities with less scrutiny. Veronica, you know, is fortunate to count several powerful senators among her regular patrons, a network of influence that affords her a degree of protection from the harshest of these measures. Yet, even she understands that her position remains precarious, constantly threatened by rumor and fear. The disease has changed everything, she murmurs, her gaze fixed on the endless parade of gondolas below. Even when we appear healthy, we're viewed with greater suspicion. Some courtesans now provide only conversation and entertainment, refusing physical intimacy entirely. It's a different world. Indeed, the social fabric of Venice, and much of Europe, is subtly but irrevocably changing in response to the epidemic. Public bathhouses, once popular and bustling social venues where people congregated to cleanse and converse, are closing down across the continent. They have become irrevocably associated with disease transmission, places of peril rather than pleasure. Kissing as a form of greeting, once a common and accepted social ritual among men of equal status in many European regions, is rapidly falling out of favor, replaced by wary nods or more formal bows. Even the shared communion cup in church, a sacred vessel, is increasingly viewed with suspicion, a potential conduit for illness rather than grace. Your time in Venice has offered a fascinating glimpse into how a relatively well-organized and sophisticated society attempts to respond to an epidemic of this scale. Yet, a restless curiosity tugs at you, a desire to understand conditions elsewhere, particularly in the lands beyond the protective embrace of the Italian city-states. So, as autumn approaches once more, painting the Venetian skies with hues of soft gold and rose, you decide to journey northward, crossing the formidable Alps into the vast and fragmented German territories of the Holy Roman Empire. The journey is arduous, a stark contrast to the relative ease of Venetian life. You once again join a merchant caravan, this time bound for the great trading city of Augsburg. The route demands crossing treacherous mountain passes while the weather still permits, before the harsh grip of winter seals them off entirely. The Alpine crossing is breathtaking in its raw, untamed beauty. Towering, snow-capped peaks pierce the cerulean sky, verdant valleys cradle sparkling, clear mountain streams, and ancient forests stretch for miles, ablaze with the fiery colors of autumn. But it is also incredibly dangerous. The narrow, winding paths cling precariously to sheer mountainsides, sometimes barely wide enough for the packhorses, let alone the cumbersome wagons. At night, you seek refuge in rustic mountain hostels, rough-hewn structures offering basic shelter, or, more often, sleep under the vast, star-strewn canopy of the sky when no other sanctuary is available. Your fellow travelers are a diverse, colorful group, a microcosm of Renaissance Europe, shrewd Italian merchants, their wagons laden with precious silks and exotic spices destined for northern markets. Diligent German craftsmen, returning home after honing their skills in the renowned workshops of Italy. Pious pilgrims, their faces etched with weariness but also spiritual resolve, returning from Rome. And a handful of earnest students, traveling between the burgeoning universities of Padua and Heidelberg. Around the crackling campfire each night, as the mountain air grows crisp and cold, conversation inevitably turns to the pervasive epidemic sweeping across Europe. In Milan, they're saying it's a punishment for the French invasion, declares a silk merchant from Florence, warming his hands by the flames. God's righteous judgment on Charles and his armies for their arrogance and conquest. Then why are the rest of us suffering? Counters a pragmatic German silversmith from Nuremberg, his voice resonating with indignation. Even innocent children are showing signs of the disease. What sin could they have committed? A young student from the University of Padua, who has been diligently studying medicine, offers a different, more scholarly, but equally speculative perspective. My professors say it's a corruption of the humors, caused by an unfavorable alignment of the planets, particularly the malevolent influence of Saturn. They are still fiercely debating whether it's a new disease entirely, or a more virulent, mutated form of leprosy or elephantiasis, somehow awakened. You listen carefully to these disparate theories, reflecting on the profound human struggle to make sense of calamity, the desperate grasping for explanations that fit their current understanding of the world. The deeply religious interpret it as divine punishment, a moral reckoning. The educated, bound by ancient wisdom, look to classical medical theories and the ominous pronouncements of astrology. The xenophobic, fueled by fear, quickly blame foreigners or marginalized groups, finding easy scapegoats. Few, you realize, possess the intellectual tools or the detached perspective to truly comprehend the complex, invisible nature of infectious disease. After nearly 2 weeks of arduous travel, your caravan finally begins its descent from the majestic mountains, emerging into the rolling, gentler countryside of southern Germany. The landscape unfurls before you like a vast, carefully woven tapestry, a patchwork of dense forests, meticulously tilled fields, and charming small villages clustered tightly around the soaring spires of parish churches. Autumn has painted the forests in a breathtaking riot of brilliant oranges, burnished reds, and shimmering golds, a stark and vibrant contrast to the more subtle, sun-baked palette of the Italian landscape you've left behind. You reach Augsburg as the first delicate snow flurries begin to fall, a crisp herald of winter's imminent approach. This wealthy imperial free city, a glittering jewel of the Holy Roman Empire, is a formidable center of banking and commerce. It is home to powerful merchant families like the Fugers and the Welzers, whose financial empires are so vast they routinely finance kings and emperors across the continent. Its wide, orderly streets and substantial stone buildings speak volumes of its enduring prosperity and meticulous civic order. Yet, even here, in this bastion of wealth and stability, the dark shadow of the epidemic looms. Just outside the city gates, you pass a newly established hospice, a somber building dedicated to those suffering from the French disease. The afflicted, their faces and bodies cruelly marked by the characteristic sores and lesions, sit or lie listlessly in the weak autumn sunshine, their eyes often fixed on the passing travelers. Some call out for alms, their voices hoarse with suffering, as you hurry past. Within the city, you find lodging at a respectable inn that caters specifically to merchants and discerning travelers. The innkeeper, Herr Mueller, is a garrulous, portly man, always eager to share the latest local news and juicy gossip. As he shows you to your room, considerably more comfortable than most of your recent accommodations, boasting a soft feather bed and a small, inviting hearth, he readily explains the city's proactive, if still crude, response to the epidemic. The city council has banned those with the disease from public bathhouses and barber shops, he tells you, his voice firm. The Guild of Surgeons has been tasked with examining suspected cases, and those found infected must wear a special marking on their clothes and are forbidden from taverns and markets. Herr Mueller then lowers his voice conspiratorially, leaning in closer. Even Jacob Fugger's nephew, God bless him, was sent away to their country estate when he showed the first signs of the disease. Money, you see, can't protect you from God's judgment. The mention of Jacob Fugger, known throughout Europe as Jacob the Rich, perhaps the wealthiest man on the continent, whose financial empire stretched from the silver mines of Tyrol to the trading posts of India, underscores the epidemic's indiscriminate nature. If even his powerful family is touched, then truly no one is safe. During your stay in Augsburg, you delve deeper into how the epidemic is affecting different segments of society. The city maintains hospital facilities, many of them run by religious orders like the Antonines, who have long specialized in treating various skin diseases. However, their traditional remedies, a combination of fervent prayers, soothing herbal baths, and dietary regimens based on the ancient theory of humors, provide tragically little relief for this new, virulent affliction. For the wealthy, desperate physicians prescribe mercury treatments, administered as corrosive ointments rubbed into the skin, potent pills ingested internally, or, most terrifyingly, through fumigation therapy, where the patient is exposed to mercury vapor in a sealed chamber. These treatments often cause profuse salivation, which, in the ignorance of the age, is tragically misinterpreted as the body expelling the disease. What the doctors do not realize, and what you observe with growing horror, is that these very symptoms, along with the tremors, gum disease, neurological problems, and ultimate madness that many patients develop, are, in fact, the horrific signs of acute mercury poisoning. The cure, you grimly conclude, is often far worse than the disease itself. I've seen patients lose their teeth, their hair, their very minds from these mercury treatments, comments Dr. Adalbert Heim, a city physician you meet through Herr Mueller's extensive connections. He is a weary man, his eyes etched with a deep skepticism. Yet, we have little else to offer except palliative care, a meager comfort for such suffering. Dr. Heim is unusual among his colleagues for his profound skepticism about traditional treatments. Most physicians still adhere strictly to Galenic medicine, a system of thought that has remained virtually unchanged since ancient times. They steadfastly believe that illness results from an imbalance in the four bodily humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and treat accordingly with crude, often brutal methods like bloodletting, purging, and the administration of substances classified as hot, cold, wet, or dry to counteract the perceived humoral imbalance. The ancients never described this disease, Dr. Heim tells you, his voice echoing with a frustrated wonder as he gestures towards his modest medical library, filled with heavy, leather-bound tomes of classical texts. That's what makes it so confounding, so terrifying. We have no guidance from Hippocrates or Galen. We must observe and learn for ourselves, for the first time in centuries. This empirical approach, this radical idea of learning through direct observation and experience rather than relying solely on the hallowed authorities of antiquity, represents the leading edge of medical thinking in this period. It will, eventually, blossom into the full flower of the scientific revolution, but for now, it remains a brave, often lonely, minority view, fighting against centuries of ingrained tradition. As winter deepens its icy grip, you witness how the rhythm of life in Northern Europe adapts to the harsh, unforgiving season. The days grow brutally short, with darkness descending by mid-afternoon, swallowing the narrow streets in a chilling gloom. People retreat indoors, seeking warmth and shelter, their lives becoming more insular, centered around the flickering hearths of their homes. Families gather around the precious fires, burning costly fuel to ward off the penetrating cold. The fortunate have well-stocked stores of food to last them until the meager promise of spring: salted meat, dried fish, hearty root vegetables, and preserved fruits. The poor, however, subsist on coarse, dark bread and whatever meager provisions they can afford at the increasingly expensive winter markets, a daily struggle for survival. Despite the numbing cold and the pervasive shadow of disease, life, remarkably, continues. The Christmas season brings its ancient traditions. Solemn processions wind through the snowy streets, and mystery plays, depicting biblical stories with earnest amateur actors, are performed in market squares. Guilds compete to present the most impressive pageants, their elaborate floats and costumed performers briefly distracting from the harsh realities of the world. Even in these darkest hours, the human spirit, resilient and defiant, seeks light, meaning, and connection. For a time, the city's vibrant festivities provided a welcome, if fleeting, distraction from the epidemic's pervasive shadow. The colorful pageants, boisterous markets, and communal gatherings offered moments of shared joy and a collective turning away from the grim realities that stalked the streets. But as January's deep freeze descended upon Augsburg, biting winds scouring the cobblestones and turning canals to ice, a curious change occurred. You began to notice how the disease seemed to recede, a subtle lull in its relentless march. Fewer new cases were reported in the bustling public spaces, and even some of the most afflicted victims experienced a temporary, hopeful improvement, their fevers subsiding, their painful sores appearing to dry and heal. Dr. Heim, a physician whose keen observations had begun to set him apart, had an intriguing theory about this shift. With a thoughtful frown etched upon his brow, he explained that the disease, much like many common fevers, appeared to wax and wane with the natural rhythms of the seasons. Perhaps, he posited, the extreme cold somehow inhibited its spread or diminished its potency. Or, he considered, it might simply be that people, driven indoors by the harsh weather, gathered less often in crowded public spaces, thereby reducing the opportunities for contagion. His insights, born from meticulous, if unsystematic, observation, were truly remarkable for the era. They represented an early, intuitive understanding of concepts we now categorize as disease seasonality and the critical role of social contact and transmission. Yet, without the foundational framework of germ theory or a coherent understanding of infection, such brilliant observations remained largely isolated insights, fascinating but disconnected threads rather than the building blocks of a comprehensive scientific theory. During your winter in Augsburg, a city grappling with both ancient traditions and the dawn of new ideas, you gained a profound acquaintance with its diverse social classes and their dramatically differing experiences of the epidemic. The patrician families, exemplified by the immensely wealthy Fuggers whose mercantile empires stretched across Europe, resided in magnificent, fortified stone houses. These grand residences boasted private wells, offering a clean water source, and elaborate privy chambers, allowing for a standard of hygiene far superior to that of the commoners. When illness inevitably struck, these privileged few could retreat to their sprawling country estates, seeking refuge from the urban contagion in the perceived purity of the countryside. They commanded access to the city's most esteemed physicians and could afford the most expensive, often exotic, treatments available, however dubious or ineffective these might ultimately prove to be. Below them in the social hierarchy were the guild masters, the skilled craftsmen, bakers, weavers, silversmiths, tanners, who formed the indispensable backbone of the city's robust economy. They lived more modestly than the patricians, yet still enjoyed considerable comforts, their lives marked by a respectable prosperity earned through diligent labor. Their workshops and homes were frequently combined within the same building, a testament to their dedication to craft and family. Here, family members, apprentices, and journeymen lived and worked in close proximity, a vibrant community under one roof. This very closeness, however, became a perilous vulnerability. When one fell ill, the disease often swept swiftly through the entire household. Journeymen and laborers, the skilled and unskilled workers who powered Augsburg's industries, inhabited rented rooms or simple, often cramped dwellings in the city's less desirable quarters. These were the winding, shadowed alleys and overcrowded districts where sanitation was rudimentary at best. They relied on public wells for their water, often bustling hubs of social interaction, and shared public bathhouses for bathing, both potential vectors for the epidemic's insidious spread. When sickness struck, they might receive rudimentary charity care from compassionate religious institutions, but for many, the cruel necessity of survival meant they had to continue working for as long as their bodies would allow, possessing no other means of support for their families. The deepest despair and suffering were reserved for the poorest, the beggars, the day laborers who lived hand-to-mouth, and the growing population of displaced rural people who flocked to the cities seeking opportunity, only to find squalor. Living in appallingly overcrowded conditions, often in makeshift shelters or shared tenements, with inadequate nutrition and non-existent sanitation, they were especially vulnerable not only to the new epidemic, but to all manner of diseases that preyed on the weakened and exposed. By the spring of 1501, you had spent nearly a year immersed in the life of Augsburg, diligently observing its complex response to the continuing epidemic. The initial, widespread panic that had gripped the populace had gradually subsided, transmuted into a grim, weary acceptance. As the disease became endemic rather than an acute epidemic, transforming from a novel, terrifying crisis into a persistent, albeit unwelcome, feature of daily life, people began to adapt. They developed new social customs and implemented rudimentary public health measures, often born of necessity and collective experience, to minimize risk while striving to continue their essential activities. The once bustling communal gatherings were replaced by more cautious interactions. Families learned to nurse their sick in isolation, and the dead were interred with a quieter, more somber dignity. As the snows finally melted and the ancient travel routes became passable once more, a fresh restlessness stirred within you. You decided it was time to journey onward, drawn by the intellectual promise of Heidelberg, a renowned university town where scholars were reportedly documenting the disease with increasing precision. You secured passage with a merchant convoy, their wagons laden with goods, traveling along the river routes that snaked through the very heart of the German-speaking lands. The countryside you traversed bore the indelible marks of both enduring prosperity and harsh, recent hardship. Well-tended fields, meticulously cultivated for generations, surrounded substantial, thriving villages, their timbered houses hinting at long-standing communities. Yet, between these pockets of vitality, you also witnessed the stark evidence of struggle, abandoned farmsteads, their roofs caved in, slowly being reclaimed by encroaching forest and uncultivated land, once fertile, now lying fallow. The preceding decades had been tumultuous, bringing increasing social tensions, localized peasant revolts fueled by injustice, fervent religious dissent as the Reformation began to stir, and relentless economic pressures wrought by changing trade patterns. The epidemic, you realized, was but one, albeit devastating, challenge among many facing the common people of Europe during this pivotal age. In the small, often isolated villages where your convoy paused for the night, you observed firsthand how these rural communities were affected by the disease. The spread here was noticeably slower than in the densely packed, interconnected cities. Yet, once the contagion breached their quiet isolation, it often moved with tragic efficiency through entire family groups, a grim reaper harvesting kin. You heard heart-wrenching stories of entire households afflicted, with no one well enough to tend the vital crops in the fields or care for the precious livestock, threatening not just lives but livelihoods. The rural understanding of the disease, shaped by generations of practical experience and local lore, differed somewhat from the emerging urban, proto-scientific perspectives. Village healers, often wise women whose knowledge of traditional herbal remedies had been passed down through generations, offered treatments based on indigenous plants. Guaiacum wood, if it could be acquired through the tenuous trade networks, was prized, but more often, native herbs like sassafras, sarsaparilla, and bearberry were employed, believed to purify the blood and restore balance to the ailing body. Some of these botanical concoctions, you mused, might actually possess mild anti-inflammatory or immune-supporting properties, providing modest relief from symptoms, even as their theoretical basis remained steeped in misunderstanding and ancient wisdom. Religious responses, deeply ingrained in the fabric of rural life, were particularly fervent. Processions, solemn special masses, and arduous pilgrimages to local shrines became desperate pleas for divine intervention against the relentless epidemic. You witnessed villagers, their faces etched with a blend of fear and profound faith, carrying candles and icons, their collective prayers echoing through the narrow lanes. Some villages, reaching back into an older, pre-Christian past, revived ancient practices alongside their Christian observances, hanging protective herbs over doorways, burying symbolic objects at field boundaries, or meticulously observing specific taboos, all believed to ward off illness and maintain the precarious balance of their world. As your journey continued, tracing the majestic course of the Rhine River, you passed through increasingly prosperous lands. Verdant vineyards climbed the sun-drenched hillsides, promising the famous Rhine wines, renowned and exported throughout Europe. Imposing castles, symbols of feudal power, perched defiantly on strategic heights, serving as the strongholds of the minor nobility who controlled the local territories and exacted tolls. River traffic was constant and bustling, barges laden with an astonishing array of goods moving steadily between major trading centers, a lifeblood of commerce flowing through the heart of the continent. At one bustling riverside inn, filled with the hearty laughter of merchants and the clinking of tankards, you chanced to meet a group of students, their faces bright with youthful intellect, returning to Heidelberg after the winter break. They were eager to share the latest medical discussions buzzing through the university's hallowed halls, where physicians were painstakingly documenting the progression and symptoms of this baffling new disease with increasing precision. Professor Theodoricus has identified distinct stages, explained a serious young man named Heinrich, his eyes alight with academic fervor. He describes the primary stage, marked by a single sore, usually, though not exclusively, on the private parts. Then comes the secondary stage, characterized by a widespread rash and fever. And now, he's describing a terrifying tertiary stage that may appear years, even decades, later, manifesting with large, rubbery swellings known as gummas and insidious afflictions of the brain and heart. And they're still debating whether it's truly a new affliction or if it's merely a more virulent mutation of other known diseases, added another student, his voice dropping conspiratorially. Some of the older masters contend it's a more aggressive form of leprosy, while others, particularly those who follow the latest reports from Spain and Portugal, believe it's an entirely novel contagion, tragically brought back from the mysterious islands Columbus recently discovered across the ocean. These students, you observed, were brimming with theoretical knowledge, their minds keen and their arguments passionate, yet they possessed little practical experience treating the suffering afflicted by the disease. Still, their systematic approach to understanding the malady, their careful observation, detailed documentation, and methodical classification of symptoms represented an important, nascent shift in medical thinking, a move that would eventually pave the way for more effective treatments in the centuries to come. You finally reached Heidelberg as spring's full glory bloomed across the picturesque Neckar Valley. The town itself was dominated by two imposing structures: its world-renowned university, whose spires pierced the sky, and the formidable castle of the Electors Palatine, the powerful rulers of this prosperous territory, perched regally on the hills above. Situated at the junction of major trade routes, Heidelberg was a veritable crossroads where ideas and goods flowed freely, making it both an intellectually vibrant hub and, paradoxically, highly vulnerable to the rapid spread of disease. The university, a beacon of learning, attracted scholars from across Europe, fostering a community far more cosmopolitan and diverse than the surrounding region. In its bustling lecture halls and fiery public disputations, the latest theories about the epidemic were debated with intense intellectual rigor. But for all their profound learning and eloquent arguments, the esteemed professors within their academic ivory tower had few truly effective treatments to offer those suffering in the crowded town below. In Heidelberg, you found lodging with a printer named Johannes Meer, a man whose workshop hummed with the intellectual pulse of the city. He produced a wide array of works, including vital medical texts, which gave you unparalleled access to the latest written knowledge about the disease. Treatises and broadsides, many hastily printed, arrived from physicians across Europe, often starkly illustrated with woodcuts vividly depicting the characteristic symptoms. These sell quickly, Hermir told you, his voice low with the urgency of demand, as he showed you a recently published pamphlet titled On the French Disease and Its Remedies by a Spanish physician, its pages still smelling faintly of fresh ink. Everyone seeks information, he explained, hoping to protect themselves or find some measure of relief for afflicted family members. The astute printer introduced you to Dr. Alexander Seitz, a local physician who had written extensively on the epidemic, his observations widely respected. Dr. Seitz had developed a theory that the disease had passed from animals to humans through what he termed improper sexual contact, a misguided, yet in its attempt to rationalize, a fascinating effort to explain its mysterious origins. The moral degradation of our time has invited this scourge upon us, Dr. Seitz confided to you solemnly, his gaze unwavering. God permits such evils, he declared, when men stray from natural law and divine ordinance. His explanation, you noted, was typical of this transitional period in scientific thought, blending emerging medical observation with deeply ingrained traditional moral and religious frameworks. Through your extensive discussions with scholars and physicians in Heidelberg, you began to gain a much clearer picture of how medical understanding was slowly but surely evolving in response to the epidemic. The venerable Galenic system, the bedrock of European medicine for over a millennium, based on the theory of the four humors, was being stretched to its limits to accommodate a disease that simply refused to fit neatly into its established categories. Some practitioners, with a growing sense of unease, were beginning to question fundamental aspects of this ancient wisdom, even while they continued to work largely within its venerable, yet increasingly strained, framework. By the summer of 1501, reports filtering in from across Europe indicated that the epidemic, while still widespread, continued largely unabated, though perhaps, you noted with a cautious optimism, with a discernible decrease in its initial virulence. The disease remained prevalent, a constant threat, but fewer victims seemed to progress to its most severe, terrifying stages within a short time frame. Whether this represented a genuine change in the disease itself, a natural attenuation, or an increased immunity developing within the broader population remained, maddeningly, unclear to contemporary observers, a mystery yet to be solved. As you reflected on your extensive journey through epidemic-stricken Europe, you began to recognize with stark clarity how profoundly this disease was shaping society, far beyond the obvious and devastating physical suffering it inflicted. It had irrevocably transformed social norms, influencing the very ways people interacted. It permeated art and literature, leaving its mark on creative expression. It challenged the ancient authority of medical traditions, forcing new lines of inquiry. It reinforced powerful religious interpretations of illness, strengthening faith or provoking doubt. And it subtly, but significantly altered intimate behaviors, breeding caution and fear. Like the Black Death before it, you realized this new epidemic would undeniably leave an indelible, lasting mark on European culture and consciousness for generations to come. On a warm, languid evening, you found yourself seated in the verdant garden of a Heidelberg tavern, the air thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and intellectual discourse. Around you, a group of students and scholars debated the future, their voices animated. Despite the continuing presence of the disease, there was a palpable, if cautious, optimism among these educated young men. They spoke with fervent excitement of new discoveries unfolding across the globe, of new lands being charted, and of bold new ideas beginning to break free from the long-held constraints of medieval thought. "We live in an age of wonders and terrors," mused a young scholar of astronomy, his eyes gazing up at the first stars pricking through the twilight. "Columbus finds new worlds across the ocean, challenging all we thought we knew of the Earth. The Turks press against our eastern borders, threatening our very civilization. Strange diseases emerge, defying our physicians. Old certainties crumble before our very eyes. Yet," he concluded, his voice ringing with conviction, "knowledge grows. Perhaps our children will understand what we can only question now." His words, you thought, perfectly captured the profound paradox of this pivotal moment in history, a time of both unprecedented crisis and remarkable, exhilarating advancement. As darkness fully fell and lanterns were lit, casting a warm, flickering glow around the garden, you pondered what the coming years would bring as Europe continued to grapple with this mysterious disease that had so quickly and indelibly embedded itself in its medical, social, and cultural landscape. Your time in Heidelberg had been profoundly enlightening, offering a window into the intellectual ferment of the age. But as autumn approached in 1501, a deep pull drew you to continue your journey. France called to you. The powerful kingdom whose soldiers, returning from the Italian campaigns, had first brought widespread attention to the disease that now, in much of Europe, bore their name. What might you discover in the land where it all began, at least in the European consciousness? You joined a wine merchant, a robust man named Henri Beaufort, who was traveling to Strasbourg and then down the Rhine toward Paris. Henri, a man whose face was weathered by countless journeys, had been making this route twice yearly for decades, carrying German wines to eager French markets and returning with coveted French luxuries for his German customers. He was, in essence, a walking chronicle of changing times. "When I began as a young man, the roads were more dangerous," he told you, his voice rumbling as your barge glided smoothly down the Rhine. "But the people were healthier, less fearful. Now, we have better order, fewer outright robberies preying on honest merchants. But this new sickness," he sighed, "makes everyone fearful of strangers, of breath, of touch." Henri explained how the disease had profoundly affected his trade, altering centuries-old customs. Customers, once convivial, no longer drank from the same cups during wine tastings, preferring their own. Innkeepers, who once encouraged communal sleeping arrangements for weary travelers to maximize space and warmth, now provided separate beds, or even entire rooms, where possible. In some cautious towns, merchants arriving from affected regions were required to remain outside the city walls for a period of quarantine before being allowed to enter and conduct their business. He shrugged philosophically, a gesture of weary acceptance. "We adapt. Life continues. Trade must flow." The journey to Paris, a winding odyssey that took nearly 3 weeks, followed rivers wherever possible and rough, ancient roads were necessary. Along the way, Henri, with his encyclopedic knowledge of the land, pointed out the subtle but significant changes in architecture, the cut of clothing, and local customs as you transitioned from German to French territories. Language, too, shifted gradually, with local dialects often more distinct from each other than the official, formalized tongues of distant courts. You passed through villages still bearing the scars of the 100 Years' War, a brutal conflict that had only recently ended. Some were slowly rebuilding, their communities painstakingly recovering after decades of devastating conflict between England and France. Others remained abandoned, ghost towns quietly reclaimed by encroaching forest and field, a stark reminder of human cost. The common people, you reflected, had endured so much in recent generations: war, famine, plague, and now this new, mysterious disease. Their resilience, you realized, was truly remarkable. In the smaller settlements dotting the northern French countryside, you continued to observe how rural communities coped with the epidemic, their solutions often born of tradition and necessity. Without access to trained physicians or well-stocked apothecaries, they relied on traditional healers, often wise women whose extensive knowledge of herbal remedies had been passed down through generations. These practitioners, deeply attuned to the rhythms of nature, used local plants like burdock, dandelion, and nettles to make infusions and poultices, their hands guided by ancestral wisdom. They couldn't cure the disease, they readily admitted, but their remedies often provided temporary, much-needed relief from its agonizing symptoms. My grandmother taught me to treat the sores with a paste made from comfrey root, one village healer told you, her hands gnarled but steady, when you expressed interest in her methods. It soothes the pain and helps them dry. For the fevers, she continued, we use willow bark tea. For the aches in the bones, a hot compress of mustard seed. Her pragmatic approach, you noted, focused squarely on alleviating suffering and supporting the body, rather than on theoretical causes she could not comprehend. Religious practices offered another, equally vital, response to the epidemic in these devout rural communities. In one small, deeply faithful village, you witnessed a solemn procession honoring Saint Roch, the patron saint revered for his protection against plague and infectious disease. Villagers, their faces upturned in fervent prayer, carried flickering candles and revered relics through the cobbled streets, stopping purposefully at homes where the sick lay suffering. Priests, their voices ringing with solemn authority, offered blessings and, for the dying, administered the last rites. Despite the limited physical benefit of these rituals, they provided profound psychological comfort, binding the community together in shared ritual and maintaining a fragile sense of solidarity in the face of overwhelming suffering. As you approached Paris, the countryside around you grew noticeably more densely populated and visibly prosperous. Fields were meticulously tended, their boundaries sharply defined, and villages appeared larger and more frequently. The Royal Road, a major artery, was bustling with a constant stream of travelers, merchants with their laden wagons, pilgrims on their sacred journeys, nobles with their elaborate entourages, and royal messengers on urgent business, their horses galloping at a furious pace. At night, you stayed in progressively grander inns, each one better equipped to cater to this steady, important traffic. Paris announced itself from afar, a distinct haze of smoke hanging perpetually over its clustered spires and towering fortifications. Unlike the compact, often walled Italian cities you had visited, Paris had long outgrown its ancient defenses, sprawling organically beyond its old boundaries into the surrounding fields, a testament to its immense growth. It was, you learned, one of Europe's largest and most vibrant cities, home to perhaps 100,000 souls, crowded into its labyrinthine narrow streets, and impressive multi-story timber-framed buildings that seemed to lean towards each other. You parted ways with Henri, who was headed directly to the wine merchant's quarter, and found modest lodging near the venerable University of Paris. This district, famously known as the Latin Quarter, buzzed with the intellectual energy of countless students and scholars, all conversing in the international language of learning. Booksellers, diligent copyists, and busy stationers clustered around the university, eagerly supplying the essential tools of intellectual trade. Taverns overflowed with young men, their voices passionate, arguing philosophy, theology, and, increasingly, the urgent new theories of medicine. The University of Paris had long been acknowledged as one of Europe's greatest centers of medical learning, its faculty physicians, rigorously trained in the ancient Galenic tradition, among the most respected in all of Christendom. Yet they, like their counterparts across Europe, had been profoundly humbled by this new, relentless disease that defied their classical understanding and resisted their most time-honored treatments. You made the acquaintance of a keen-eyed medical student named Jean-Claude, who offered to show you the Hôtel Dieu, Paris's ancient, venerable hospital. Situated near the majestic Notre Dame Cathedral, it had been founded centuries ago by the Church to provide care for the city's poor and indigent, relying heavily on the tireless labor of nuns and the charity of the wealthy. The Hôtel Dieu proved a sobering, unforgettable sight. Long, cavernous wards housed dozens of patients, often with 2 or even 3 souls crammed into a single bed, a testament to the sheer volume of suffering. The air was thick and heavy, laden with the inescapable smells of sickness, unwashed bodies, and the pungent aroma of herbal remedies, a constant, oppressive presence. Nuns, their faces serene but their movements efficient, moved tirelessly between beds, offering what solace they could: food, drink, and basic care. Physicians, cloaked in their robes of authority, made their rounds only once daily, examining patients briefly and prescribing treatments based on the reigning humoral theory. Bloodletting was administered to those deemed too hot and wet, while warming substances were prescribed for those thought to be too cold and dry, a delicate dance of theoretical balance. "They've set aside a separate ward for those with the French disease," Jean-Claude whispered to you, his voice hushed, pointing to a doorway from which a nun emerged, her arms laden with soiled linens, the heavy scent of decay momentarily stronger. Too many cases to ignore, though the masters still debate whether it's truly new or just a virulent form of leprosy. Later, over cups of thin wine in a bustling student tavern, Jean-Claude, his youthful face flushed with drink and intellectual fervor, explained the current medical thinking at the university. The faculty, he confided, was deeply divided. The traditionalists, fiercely protective of ancient wisdom, insisted that Galen's intricate system could, in fact, explain all diseases. They viewed the French disease as a grave corruption of the humors, perhaps caused by an unfavorable celestial alignment or by noxious, pestilential bad air rising from the earth. But some younger physicians, he lowered his voice, almost to a whisper, argue it's something entirely new, something unprecedented, requiring new approaches, new ways of thinking. He explained there was a growing, albeit quiet, interest in the methods employed by barber surgeons and empirics, practitioners whom the learned physicians had long dismissed as crude and unscientific. Mercury treatments, strong guaiacum decoctions imported from the New World, and even the brutal cauterization of the initial sores were now being studied, if discreetly, behind closed doors. This palpable tension between the established authority of traditional medical learning and the pragmatic push for practical innovation, even from unlearned sources, reflected broader currents in European thought. The very Renaissance revival of classical learning had paradoxically created both a profound reverence for ancient knowledge and, simultaneously, provided the intellectual tools and critical spirit to challenge it. As you had witnessed throughout your long journey, this devastating epidemic was powerfully accelerating that process, forcing practical innovation and desperate experimentation, even while comprehensive theoretical frameworks lagged stubbornly behind. During your extended stay in Paris, you meticulously explored the city's multifaceted response to the epidemic at various social levels, revealing a stark contrast in experience. Even the royal court, under the rule of the newly crowned Louis XII, had been touched by the insidious disease. Rumors whispered that several prominent courtiers, afflicted by the telltale sores, had been quietly sent away to country estates to recover or, more likely, to die, far from public view, preserving the illusion of royal health. The king's personal physicians, prestigious and influential, recommended a series of preventative measures to the nobility: moderate living, avoidance of excessive food and drink, severely limited sexual contact, and regular bathing in herb-infused water, a mix of common sense and ancient belief. The nobility and wealthy merchants, with their immense resources, could afford not only private care within their lavish homes, but also the most expensive, often exotic, treatments available. An apothecary near the fashionable Marais district, his shop filled with strange, potent aromas, proudly showed you his precious stock, guaiacum wood, imported at immense expense from the newly discovered Americas, mercury preparations, meticulously distilled, and complex herbal compounds with ingredients sourced from as far away as China and India. These, he confided, his voice hushed, cost more than a laborer might earn in many months, accessible only to the privileged few. For the great lords, he added, we prepare special remedies they can take discreetly, pills containing flecks of pure gold leaf and powdered pearls, said to purify noble blood. Do they work? He gave a subtle shrug, a knowing, cynical glance. Who can truly say? But they certainly satisfy those who believe their blood is, by divine right, different from that of the common folk. The burgeoning middle classes, the respected guild masters, prosperous merchants, and newly minted university graduates sought treatment from licensed physicians and reputable apothecaries. They could generally afford the mercury treatments and some of the imported remedies, though often in less elaborate, more pragmatic formulations than those prescribed to the nobility. Crucially, they also possessed both the knowledge and the means to follow physician recommendations about diet, bathing, and lifestyle, conscientiously modifying their behaviors in hopes of avoiding or mitigating the disease. The working poor, struggling for survival, had to rely primarily on barber surgeons, who were significantly more affordable than physicians. These practitioners, often without formal university education but with substantial practical experience gained through necessity, were the city's hands-on healers. They lanced painful sores, applied topical remedies, performed bloodletting, and administered mercury treatments, often in cruder, less refined forms. Their approach was direct, practical, and results-oriented, with little concern for the theoretical explanations favored by the learned elite. For the destitute, the city's beggars, and the truly indigent, only charity offered any hope of treatment. Religious orders and wealthy benefactors supported institutions like the Hôtel Dieu, a last refuge for many, and some parishes maintained small hospices specifically for their sick poor. The care provided was basic: clean bedding, regular meals, spiritual comfort through prayer, and simple, often palliative treatments. Yet, rudimentary as it was, it represented the only option for countless victims of the epidemic, a grim testament to their vulnerability. What struck you most forcibly, as you observed these varied responses, was how the epidemic itself indiscriminately crossed all social boundaries. Yet the responses to it served only to reinforce those very same divisions. The disease affected all classes, from the highest noble to the lowliest beggar, but the experience of it remained profoundly unequal. The wealthy suffered privately, cocooned in their lavish homes with the best available, if often ineffective, care, their suffering hidden from public scrutiny. The poor suffered publicly, openly exposed in the streets and crowded hospitals, with minimal assistance. Their agony is stark, visible reality for all to see. After several weeks spent delving into the complex medical and social landscape of Paris, you decided to venture into the countryside of northern France. Reports suggested that the disease was particularly widespread in Normandy, a region from which many of the soldiers who had participated in the Naples campaign had originated, making it a crucial area for your continued research. You hired a horse and joined a party of cloth merchants traveling to Rouen, a bustling port city. Rouen, once a stronghold of English occupation during the long, devastating war, was now rapidly returning to prosperity under French rule. The journey took you through rolling farmland, rich with the bounty of autumn, punctuated by ancient woodlands and small, tightly knit villages. The autumn harvest was in full swing, with peasants working communally in the fields, their bodies bent to the task of bringing in crops before the harsh grip of winter. Despite the ever-present shadow of the epidemic, the ancient rhythm of agricultural life continued, much as it had for centuries. The fundamental demands of survival, you observed, left little room for disruption, even from the most insidious disease. In one particular village where your party stopped for the night, you witnessed firsthand how rural families coped when the disease struck their isolated communities. A farmer named Michel had been suffering for nearly a year. His symptoms had begun, he recounted, with a single sore that eventually healed on its own, followed by a widespread, painful rash and deep bone pains that made agricultural labor, his very livelihood, nearly impossible. My neighbors helped with the planting, and they will help with the harvest, he told you, his voice weak but filled with gratitude, as he sat by his cottage door, too frail to join the work in the fields. Without them, my family would surely starve. Next year, God willing, I'll do the same for whoever needs aid. The communal spirit, the unwritten social contract of mutual aid, was truly his family's lifeline. Michel's wife, her face etched with worry but her hands capable, had prepared a steaming bath of herbs gathered from the surrounding countryside, comfrey, chamomile, and others you didn't immediately recognize. It eases his pain for a time, she explained softly, bathing his aching limbs. We tried the mercury ointment the traveling barber gave us, but it made him worse. His gums bled, and his hands shook so badly he couldn't even hold a cup. This pattern, you realized, repeated itself across the countryside. Communal support filling the gaping holes left by inadequate, inaccessible medical care and practical, empirical experience leading to the rejection of treatments that caused more harm than good. Without formal scientific knowledge, these rural communities were developing their own, often painful, understanding of the disease through a long, arduous process of trial and error. You finally reached Rouen as the days grew shorter and colder, the air crisp with the promise of winter. This prosperous port city, strategically located on the Seine River, had been painstakingly rebuilt since the war's end and now bustled with a vibrant, renewed commerce. English wool arrived regularly to be transformed into fine cloth by its skilled artisans, while wine and other valuable goods traveled downriver to the Atlantic coast, destined for distant markets. The magnificent cathedral, its soaring Gothic spire reaching majestically toward heaven, dominated the skyline, a symbol of enduring faith and civic pride. Through connections thoughtfully provided by the cloth merchants, you found lodging with a respectable widow, Madame Beecham, who supplemented her income by renting rooms to reputable travelers. Madame Beecham proved to be remarkably well-informed about local affairs and generously shared the city's tumultuous experience with the epidemic. When the first cases appeared 6 years ago, there was sheer panic, she told you, her voice quiet but firm, as she served a simple but hearty beef stew, its aroma filling the cozy room. People, in their fear, blamed the returning soldiers, especially those who'd been in Naples. Some of the sick were driven from their homes, denied their livelihoods, shunned by their own communities. The bishop, God bless him, had to preach forcefully against this cruelty, reminding the congregation that Christ called us to care for the sick, not to abandon them. Over time, Rouen, with its strong civic leadership, developed a more organized, compassionate response. The city council established a special hospice specifically for those afflicted with the French disease, funded by a combination of taxes and generous donations from its wealthy citizens. Barber surgeons, the pragmatic frontline healers, received special training from university-educated physicians on recognizing and treating the condition. Public bathhouses, once potential breeding grounds for contagion, were regularly inspected and strictly required to change their water between customers, a rudimentary but vital public health measure. It hasn't stopped the disease, Madame Beecham concluded with practical compassion, a sad shake of her head, but fewer people now die in the streets or suffer alone. And the fear, she added, has lessened considerably. We've learned to live with this affliction as we've lived with others before it, with a weary but persistent determination. During your stay in Rouen, you observed with particular interest how the epidemic had subtly but significantly influenced artistic expression within the city. In the Grand Cathedral, a newly installed stained glass window depicted Job, the biblical figure whose suffering from painful, widespread sores had, by this time, made him a revered patron saint for those afflicted with skin diseases. Local painters, responding to the anxieties of their time, subtly incorporated symbolic references to the epidemic in their religious works. Angels brandishing flaming swords, representing divine punishment for human transgressions, and saints offering solace and miraculous protection to the afflicted. More secular expressions of the epidemic's impact appeared in the popular broadsheets sold by bustling street vendors. These single-page prints, combining crude but effective woodcut illustrations with simple, accessible text, were immensely popular with the semi-literate audiences of the city. Some offered dubious medical advice of varying quality, while others used the disease as a stark moral lesson, showing debauched youths developing the telltale symptoms as a divine retribution for their sins. A few, reflecting the cynical humor of the common people, were purely satirical, mercilessly mocking physicians and their often ineffective, pompous treatments. You also couldn't help but notice tangible changes in social customs, subtle shifts in the fabric of daily life born of caution and fear. People now greeted each other with slight, deferential bows rather than the once common, intimate embraces or friendly kisses on the cheek. Communal drinking vessels, once a staple of taverns and public gatherings, had all but disappeared, discreetly replaced by individual cups, each person now responsible for their own, a small but profound symbol of a world transformed. Young couples found themselves under stricter chaperonage, their budding affections now scrutinized through a lens of suspicion. Parents, once content with cursory inquiries, delved into the backgrounds of potential marriage partners with unprecedented thoroughness, meticulously tracing family lines and past associations. The pervasive shadow of the disease had rendered intimacy itself suspect, transforming what was once a natural expression of affection into a potential vector for contagion, a whispered threat in the sanctity of private lives. As winter's grip tightened around Rouen, you decided to postpone further travel, deeming the arduous journeys of spring an easier prospect. You secured work with a local printer, a man named Gum, whose shop, redolent with the scent of ink, paper, and simmering glue, was a hub of intellectual activity. Your task was to help edit a newly commissioned compendium of treatments for what everyone called the French disease. You brought to this work not just a meticulous eye, but also the unique perspective gleaned from your extensive travels, applying your direct observations of symptoms and societal responses to refine descriptions and validate reported outcomes. This position offered an extraordinary vantage point into the intricate dance of how medical knowledge circulated, was debated, and evolved in direct response to practical, often brutal, realities. Gum, a robust man with ink-stained fingers and a pragmatic worldview, explained the robust market for such works. Physicians, from the renowned academics of Paris to the more provincial practitioners, eagerly purchased them, seeking to compare their own observations and methods with those of colleagues scattered across the vast and fractured medical landscape of Europe. Barber surgeons and apothecaries, often the primary caregivers for the common folk, devoured these texts for practical instructions and tested remedies. Even some educated laypeople, driven by desperation and a desire to protect their own, acquired them, hoping to treat ailing family members or even themselves without the exorbitant expense of a physician. Through this work, you meticulously tracked the evolution of treatments. Mercury, in its various forms, remained stubbornly dominant, yet it was now administered with increasing caution and in more refined, often less overtly poisonous, applications. The exotic guaiacum, newly arrived from the New World, steadily gained popularity, especially after several prominent patients, whose recovery was widely publicized, reported significant improvement following its use. Various herbal decoctions, sarsaparilla, sassafras, and China root, among others, were garnering advocates, particularly for their perceived efficacy in relieving the agonizing pain and mitigating the unsightly secondary symptoms of the disease. The most intriguing reports, however, emanated from physicians bold enough to combine approaches. Gum relayed how those who used mercury more sparingly, alternating it with carefully selected herbal remedies and meticulous attention to a patient's diet and regimen, claimed markedly better results than their peers who clung rigidly to a single, often aggressive, method. This nascent empirical approach, this philosophy of learning through systematic trial and observation rather than blind adherence to theoretical deduction, represented a profound and vital shift in medical thinking, challenging centuries of established dogma. Though practitioners still grappled with a full understanding of why certain treatments helped or harmed, they were beginning to develop more nuanced protocols, guided by the cold, hard logic of observed outcomes. During the long, often dreary winter evenings, you often found yourself drawn to discussions at a local tavern, a smoky, dimly lit haven frequented by a lively mix of physicians, apothecaries, and other educated professionals. Their spirited conversations unveiled how the escalating epidemic was influencing far broader intellectual currents, stirring debates that resonated beyond the confines of medicine. The ancients, argued an older physician, his face etched with academic rigor, a graduate of the renowned medical school at Montpellier, described many diseases with remarkable accuracy. And yet, none, not one, matches this French disease precisely. His pronouncement hung heavy in the air, challenging the very bedrock of Renaissance thought. Either it is truly new, he continued, gesturing with a practiced hand, which fundamentally challenges the cherished notion that all-important knowledge was already known to the ancients, or, and here his voice dropped, adding gravitas to his words, they knew it by another name, which means we have fundamentally misunderstood their sacred texts. Either possibility, you realized with a jolt, was profoundly disruptive to the prevailing Renaissance reverence for classical authority. If new diseases could emerge, entirely uncatalogued by Hippocrates or Galen, what other novel phenomena might exist beyond the scope of ancient knowledge? If ancient texts, revered as infallible, had been misinterpreted for centuries, how reliable was any inherited wisdom on other subjects, be it philosophy, astronomy, or governance? The epidemic was not merely killing bodies, it was dissecting the very intellectual foundations of Europe. As winter gradually yielded to the tentative warmth of spring in 1502, you found yourself reflecting deeply on all you had witnessed during your arduous journey through epidemic-stricken Europe. You had seen how a single, devastating disease could inexorably transform entire societies, challenging entrenched medical paradigms, reshaping fundamental social interactions, subtly influencing artistic expression, and simultaneously reinforcing ancient social divisions while occasionally, in moments of shared vulnerability, even bridging them. Most profoundly, you had observed humanity's remarkable, often heartbreaking, adaptability. From Venice's sophisticated public health measures, designed with an almost modern foresight, to the resilient, communal support systems in rural villages, from the tireless efforts of physicians evolving their treatments to the intimate adjustments individuals made to their most private behaviors, people had responded to the epidemic with a potent blend of creativity and resilience, even amidst profound suffering and paralyzing fear. As the days lengthened and the muddy roads hardened, making travel possible again, you considered where your journey might take you next. After bearing witness to the epidemic's profound impact in Italy, Germany, and France, perhaps the isolated shores of England beckoned, offering a different perspective, or perhaps the sun-drenched Iberian Peninsula, the very launching point for Columbus' momentous voyages, a place intrinsically linked to the disease's disputed origins. Or you might even return to Italy to observe how the situation had evolved since your departure nearly 2 years prior. Wherever you went, you knew you would carry with you a deeper, more nuanced understanding of how disease shapes history, not just through death and suffering, but through humanity's incredibly diverse and stubbornly persistent responses to that suffering. The French disease, much like the Black Death before it, would undeniably leave Europe transformed in ways both obvious and subtle, immediate and enduring. With spring's gentle warmth bathing the Norman countryside, you decided that England would be your next destination. The disease had reportedly reached the island kingdom around 1497, and you were keenly curious to see how this somewhat isolated nation had responded to the global cataclysm. In Rouen bustling port, a symphony of creaking ropes, shouting merchants, and the cries of gulls, you secured passage on a wool merchant's vessel, a sturdy cog bound for London. You took a moment to bid farewell to Madame Bon, whose warm hospitality had made the long winter months both comfortable and deeply restorative, and to the printer Gum, whose insights had been so enlightening. The Channel crossing was mercifully smooth. You had heard terrifying tales of terrible storms that could transform this narrow, treacherous sea into a death trap for unwary sailors. Yet today, the waters were merely choppy. Still, the small ship pitched and rolled enough to keep most passengers confined to the deck, their faces tinged a sickly green with seasickness. You, however, managed better than most, your seasoned traveler's stomach earning a grudging respect from the English captain. First time I took this route was 30 years ago, Captain Thomas told you, his voice raspy from years of shouting into gales, as he shared a cup of lukewarm ale in his cramped cabin. He squinted, lost in memory. Back when King Edward still sat on England's throne. Since then, I've seen 3 kings come and go, Edward, Richard, and Henry. And now, young Henry VIII has just taken the crown. He shook his head slowly, a sigh escaping his lips at the swift, relentless passage of time. The captain proved to be an invaluable source of information about how the epidemic had reached England. We first heard rumors from the French ports, he recalled, his brow furrowed. Around 96. By 97, cases appeared in London, Portsmouth, Bristol, anywhere with active harbors, you see. Sailors brought it, as they bring all things, good and ill, from foreign shores. He paused, taking a long pull from his ale. King Henry VII, God rest him, just passed 2 months ago. He was a cautious man, suspicious of foreigners even before the disease arrived. After it came, he tightened port restrictions, limited foreign merchants' movements. Some say it slowed the spread, others that it merely drove the afflicted into hiding, fearing deportation. As your ship finally entered the winding embrace of the Thames estuary, the landscape began to unfold dramatically before your eyes. The low, green marshes gradually gave way to increasingly dense settlements, clustering more tightly along the riverbanks. As you approached the city proper, London announced itself with an unmistakable grandeur. First, a dizzying forest of ship masts, then the imposing, gray bulk of the Tower of London, and finally, the singular, majestic dome of St. Paul's Cathedral, rising above the sprawling cityscape. Hundreds of small boats, like agile water insects, darted across the river, ferrying people and goods between its bustling shores. You disembarked at a bustling wharf, instantly surrounded by the clamor of commerce. Porters, their muscles bulging, shouted competing offers to carry baggage. Vendors, their voices hoarse, hawked hot pies and foaming ale from makeshift stalls. Customs officials, stern-faced, meticulously examined cargo, their movements sharp and efficient. The pervasive smell of the river, a mix of brackish water and estuary mud, mingled with the acrid scent of wood smoke, the savory aroma of roasting meat from nearby cookhouses, the yeasty vapors of breweries, and that indefinable, earthy scent of thousands of humans living in close, vibrant proximity. England, you realized, felt both intimately familiar and strikingly foreign after your prolonged time on the continent. The language, while sharing Germanic roots, sounded entirely different to your ears, its cadences and pronunciations uniquely English. The architecture showcased distinct Norman influences, yet it was interwoven with distinctive English elements, giving it a character all its own. Fashion seemed a season or two behind the cutting-edge styles of Paris, yet with subtle variations that unmistakably marked it as uniquely English. Through Captain Thomas's recommendation, you found lodging at the Tabard Inn in Southwark, nestled across the river from the city proper. This ancient establishment was famed for hosting pilgrims traveling to Canterbury, immortalized in Chaucer's celebrated tales written a century earlier, a connection that infused the very air with history. The innkeeper, Master Baxter, a man whose round face was perpetually creased with a welcoming smile, was a third-generation host, brimming with stories about famous guests and London's ever-changing fortunes. My grandfather welcomed Chaucer himself. He boasted with a twinkle in his eye, though you suspected the timeline didn't quite support this claim, more a testament to the inn's enduring legacy than precise fact. And my father saw Jack Cade's rebellion come right past our door. Me, I've seen the sweating sickness take thousands. And now this French pox making its rounds, too. Keeps a man busy, eh? Master Baxter proved to be a remarkably valuable guide to London's intricate response to the epidemic. The city's governance was a complex tapestry, with the Crown, the powerful city corporation, the numerous parishes, and the influential guilds all holding overlapping authority. This multi-layered structure inevitably created a patchwork approach to public health, less centralized and systematically organized than Venice's meticulous measures, but certainly more coordinated than the often desperate, ad hoc rural responses you had witnessed. The mayor ordered examinations of bathhouses and stews, Master Baxter explained, using the local English term for brothels, his voice dropping slightly in a conspiratorial tone. Many were closed, especially here in Southwark, where the Bishop of Winchester licensed them for centuries, mind you. The city physicians, a learned lot they are, advised against shared cups and bedding. And some parishes, good souls, even established special almshouses for their afflicted poor. You learned that London, unlike some continental cities that had established dedicated facilities, possessed no designated hospital specifically for those suffering from the French pox. Instead, existing charitable institutions like St. Bartholomew's, St. Thomas's, and various parish infirmaries had adapted, often straining at their seams, to accommodate the growing number of cases. Treatment, you quickly realized, varied dramatically depending on a patient's means and connections, a stark reflection of the city's profound social stratification. Over the coming days, armed with a letter of introduction from Gum the printer, you embarked on a deeper exploration of London's medical landscape. You were granted an audience with Dr. Thomas Linacre, one of England's most prominent physicians, a man recently returned from Italy, where he had studied at the famed University of Padua. Linacre, with his sharp intellect and refined demeanor, represented the vibrant new Renaissance learning that was slowly but surely taking root in England. Our medical knowledge, it must be admitted, still lags behind Italy's, he confessed, sweeping his hand towards his impressive library, filled with vellum-bound volumes. But we are advancing quickly. I myself have translated several key Greek medical texts, works previously unavailable in England, direct from the original Greek. King Henry VIII, a man of remarkable intellectual curiosity even at his young age, has shown great interest in establishing a college of physicians to regulate practice and raise standards across the realm. Dr. Linacre's approach to the French pox vividly reflected his humanist education. We must return to original Hippocratic principles, he asserted, his voice firm with conviction. Careful observation, detailed case histories, meticulous attention to environmental factors. The Arab commentators and medieval schoolmen, for all their industry, obscured much of this essential wisdom, adding layers of dogma where direct experience was needed. You inquired about the specific treatments employed in England. Linacre confirmed much was the same as elsewhere. Mercury remained the primary recourse, though he personally advised a more moderate and carefully monitored application than most of his more zealous colleagues. Guaiacum from the Indies, he conceded, showed definite promise, especially for alleviating the excruciating bone pains associated with the disease. Some of his colleagues, he added, reported success with China root and sarsaparilla, though the evidence remained anecdotal. More revealing, however, was Lineker's candid assessment of Mercury's profound limitations and devastating side effects. "I've documented numerous cases," he said, a note of weariness in his voice, "where the treatment causes worse symptoms than the disease itself. Excessive salivation, tremors so severe patients cannot hold a cup, the inevitable loss of teeth, even confusion and delirium. Yet, patients demand it, often clinging to the belief that stronger reactions indicate more effective medicine. It is a formidable challenge to persuade them otherwise." This tension between patient expectations and objective physician observations starkly highlighted the challenges of medical progress in this era. Popular understanding, shaped by superstition and desperation, consistently lagged behind emerging scientific knowledge, with patients frequently preferring dramatic treatments with visibly violent effects, regardless of their long-term outcomes, over gentler, potentially more effective, approaches. Through your connection with Lineker, you gained access to St. Bartholomew's Hospital, affectionately known as Bart's, one of London's oldest and most respected charitable institutions. Founded in the 12th century, Bart's had evolved from a monastic infirmary into a substantial hospital primarily serving London's burgeoning poor. The dissolution of the monasteries, that seismic upheaval of English religious life, still lay decades in the future. So religious brothers and sisters continued to provide the bulk of the nursing care, their devotion a balm amidst suffering. Brother Michael, a kind-faced friar who oversaw a ward housing several pox victims, explained the hospital's approach with a weary pragmatism. "We separate them from others when possible," he said, his gaze sweeping over the crowded space, though space constraints often make this impossible. "We provide clean bedding, what nutritious food we can acquire, and basic wound care. For those who can tolerate it, mercury treatment is offered, albeit carefully. Otherwise, we focus on comfort and, perhaps most importantly, spiritual consolation." The ward itself was a sobering sight, a long, cavernous room with rows of simple wooden beds lining both walls, each often containing one or two patients in various, agonizing stages of illness. The air hung thick with the distinct, metallic odor of disease, mingled with the sweet pungency of herbal remedies and the acrid smoke from a central hearth, struggling to ward off the chill. Attendants, their faces grim but resolute, moved silently between beds, changing dressings, offering sips of water, and emptying overflowing waste vessels. Brother Michael introduced you to several patients, each bearing their suffering with a quiet dignity and willing to share their stories. One, a former sailor named Will, a gaunt man with haunted eyes, recounted how he had contracted the disease in Cadiz 3 years earlier. "Started with a single sore," he told you, his voice raspy, "no bigger than a penny on my, well, you understand. Thought nothing of it when it healed, disappeared like a bad dream. Then came the rash, the fevers, the bone ache. Could no longer work the rigging, my joints so pained. Captain put me ashore here when I could no longer earn my keep." Will's condition had stabilized, a testament to his innate resilience and Bart's care, but the disease had left him permanently disabled, a shadow of his former robust self, irrevocably unable to return to his life at sea. The hospital provided him with shelter and basic care, a precarious lifeline, but his future remained terrifyingly uncertain. His story exemplified the profound economic impact of the epidemic, illustrating how individual misfortune rippled outwards to create lost livelihoods, increased dependency, and strained charitable resources across society. Another patient, Margaret, presented a different, equally tragic path to infection. She had been a domestic servant in a wealthy merchant's home, a life of quiet anonymity, until she married a man who had previously contracted the disease during military service in France. Unaware of his condition, she became infected and now suffered from advanced symptoms, including horrifying, destructive lesions on her face, making her a pariah. "My husband died last winter," she told you softly, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes downcast. "And his family? His family blames me for bewitching him. They refuse to acknowledge me as his widow. My former employers dismissed me as soon as the marks appeared. Without Bart's, I would be begging on the streets." Margaret's situation starkly illustrated how the disease exacerbated existing social vulnerabilities, particularly for women in a patriarchal society. Limited economic opportunities, a crushing dependency on marriage for security, and the indelible stigma of visible symptoms created a cascading series of misfortunes from which few paths to recovery existed, leaving women like Margaret utterly destitute. Beyond the hospital walls, you explored how different social classes in London experienced and responded to the epidemic, a mosaic of fear, privilege, and desperation. Through Lineker's connections, you gained a rare glimpse into the situation among the nobility and wealthy merchants. When afflicted, they received treatment in the absolute privacy of their opulent homes, attended by a retinue of physicians sworn to discretion, their illnesses hushed whispers behind closed doors. Mercury chambers, elaborate enclosed cabinets where patients sat exposed to mercury vapor, represented the most sophisticated and often terrifying treatment available to the elite, though not necessarily the most effective. London's substantial middle class, guild masters, successful merchants, lawyers, and other rising professionals, proved to be far more diligent than most in following physicians' preventative advice. They modified their behaviors, observed improved personal hygiene, a novel concept for many, and meticulously avoided suspected transmission routes. When illness did strike, they could generally afford moderate, if not lavish, treatment, without the extravagance or sheer recklessness often associated with the nobility. The working poor, apprentices, journeymen, laborers, and small shopkeepers, largely relied on barber surgeons and apothecaries for more affordable care, their options constrained by their meager wages. Self-treatment with readily available herbal remedies, purchased from market vendors, was remarkably common, a testament to both necessity and a lingering folk wisdom. Those with guild affiliations often received crucial support from these organizations when they were unable to work, providing a vital safety net tragically absent from many others. For the destitute, beggars, orphans, the disabled, and the elderly without family support, only the precarious solace of parish charity or institutions like Bart's offered any hope of care. Many suffered and died anonymously in the grimy streets or crowded, airless tenements, their cases unrecorded except in the laconic parish burial registers, which noted increased deaths from vague ailments like consumption or simply fever, masking the true, devastating toll of the French disease. Distinct from continental cities, London's response to the epidemic included uniquely English elements, clearly reflecting its particular social and political structures. Parish vestries, the local governing bodies overseeing church affairs and poor relief, took primary responsibility for their afflicted residents, rather than centralizing care at a citywide level. Guilds continued to provide a crucial network of support for their members and their families, effectively creating occupationally based safety nets. The City Corporation, London's powerful municipal government, primarily focused on regulation and prevention rather than direct treatment, a division of labor unique to the English capital. After several weeks immersed in the vibrant, often chaotic, life of London, you ventured into the English countryside, curious to observe how rural communities were faring against the persistent epidemic. You traveled with a cloth merchant, his carts laden with goods, visiting wool producers in the Cotswolds, a region of rolling, emerald hills and prosperous market towns where sheep farming had historically created considerable wealth. The pastoral landscape appeared idyllic, a scene plucked from a painter's canvas. Charming stone villages nestled snugly in green valleys, fields meticulously divided by ancient dry stone walls, and countless sheep grazing peacefully on the hillsides. Yet, even here, the epidemic had reached, though with less intensity and overt devastation than in densely populated London. In Cirencester, a substantial market town where your merchant companion had business, you met the local barber-surgeon, Master Simons. His practice served both the town and the surrounding villages, providing a bewildering array of services, from precise haircuts and agonizing tooth extractions to traditional bloodletting and the setting of broken bones. Cases of the French pox, he admitted, were becoming increasingly common among his diverse clientele. First appeared about 4 years ago, he told you, in his shop, a fascinating clutter where shining razors and fearsome surgical tools hung on the wall alongside bundles of dried herbs and arcane alchemical equipment. A wool merchant, he was, returned from London with the telltale signs. Since then, I've treated perhaps 24 cases, mostly men who traveled to the cities for business or, well, for pleasure, if you understand my meaning. Master Simons's treatments reflected a blend of practical experience and the harsh reality of his limited access to exotic remedies. Mercury I use sparingly, he explained, his eyes sharp and knowing. Too easy to poison the patient, you see. I prefer a salve of my own devising for the sores, containing comfrey and honey, good for healing. For the bone pains, a willow bark decoction, strong enough to dull the worst of it. When available, I incorporate guaiacum, but supplies are limited and costly here, and frankly, I've not seen it work miracles. His pragmatic approach, unburdened by rigid adherence to complex medical theories learned in distant universities, sometimes achieved better outcomes than the more learned physicians' treatments. Several of his patients had managed to maintain their livelihoods despite the ravages of the disease, adapting their work when symptoms flared rather than succumbing to the debilitating side effects of aggressive mercury poisoning. Through Master Simons, you met several local families profoundly affected by the epidemic. The Coopers, John, a Wainwright, his wife, and their 3 surviving children, tragically demonstrated the disease's insidious impact on family structures. John had contracted the pox in Oxford 2 years earlier and, unknowingly, infected Anne. Their youngest child, born after the infection, already showed the heartbreaking signs of congenital transmission, curved leg bones, and distinctive notched teeth. We manage as we can, and told you, her voice a study in quiet fortitude, as she continued her tireless household tasks, despite visible discomfort from her own symptoms. Neighbors help when John's hands pain him too much for fine work. The older children have learned to assist with tasks far beyond their years. We pray for strength, and we endure. The Cooper family exemplified the quiet, unseen suffering in countless households across Europe, where the disease disrupted livelihoods, strained familial relationships to breaking point, and irrevocably altered children's futures before they even began. Unlike urban victims who might access institutional care, rural families largely coped through the resilient fabric of extended family networks and community support, continuing productive work whenever physically possible, a testament to sheer necessity. In the village church, you noticed a new fresco, vibrant and stark, depicting Saint Fiacre, traditionally associated with healing skin diseases. The priest, Father Thomas, a kindly man with a weathered face, explained that veneration of particular healing saints had dramatically increased since the epidemic began. People seek heavenly intercession, he explained, his voice echoing softly in the cool stone church, when earthly remedies so often fail. Saint Fiacre, Saint Job, Saint Roch, all receive more prayers and offerings than ever before. The religious response in England, at this time, remained firmly Catholic. Henry VIII's monumental break with Rome still lay decades in the turbulent future. Masses for the afflicted, solemn processions imploring divine mercy, and increased donations for church hospitals all formed part of the spiritual campaign against the relentless epidemic. Yet, Father Thomas also acknowledged practical measures, blending faith with common sense. I advise my parishioners on cleanliness and moderation in all things, he told you, his eyes earnest. God's mercy works through natural means as well as miraculous ones. Prudence in daily habits is not contrary to faith in divine healing. After your rural sojourn, you returned to London as summer's gentle embrace approached. The city buzzed with an electrifying energy, preparing for a momentous event, the coronation of the new king, Henry VIII, following his father's death in April. Despite the ongoing, pervasive epidemic, a palpable sense of optimism pervaded the city. The young king, not yet 18, represented a new generation and fresh possibilities after his father's famously austere and cautious rule. The old king was careful with coin and foreign entanglements, observed Master Baxter, leaning conspiratorially across the tabard's counter, his eyes twinkling with speculation. The new one seems more generous, more learned, more grand in his ambitions. Whether that bodes well or ill for England remains to be seen. You witnessed the elaborate preparations for the coronation procession. Buildings throughout the city were festooned with vibrant tapestries and fluttering banners. Streets were meticulously cleaned of refuse, a rare sight, and temporary grandstands were hastily erected for the throngs of eager spectators. For a brief, intoxicating time, the oppressive shadow of the epidemic receded, momentarily forgotten as London collectively anticipated a joyous celebration. Yet, even amidst the festivities, the disease remained a phantom presence. In bandaged limbs glimpsed among the cheering crowd, in absent faces, too ill to attend the spectacle, in whispered concerns about contagion lingering in the vast, tightly packed gatherings. As June 1502 approached, you prepared for the next stage of your seemingly endless journey. After observing the epidemic's profound impact in Italy, Germany, France, and England, you decided to continue to the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, and Portugal, the very launching points for Columbus' world-altering voyages, and the source of many of the prevailing, often heated, theories about the disease's mysterious origins. Before departing, you paid a final visit to Dr. Lineker. He was deeply engrossed in collecting observations from physicians across England, meticulously transcribing them, effectively creating what would now be recognized as pioneering epidemiological data. His parchments were covered with hand-drawn maps marking outbreaks, precise tables of symptoms and disease progression, and meticulous notes on various treatment outcomes. Knowledge accumulates slowly, he told you, his voice calm, yet resolute, tapping a parchment. But it does accumulate. Each careful observation, properly recorded and shared, builds our understanding. Perhaps not in my lifetime, but eventually, this disease will yield its secrets to rational inquiry. His words captured the very essence of the emerging scientific worldview, empirical, methodical, and profoundly patient. It was a vision that would eventually transform medicine from an art based on ancient authorities and untested theories to a rigorous science grounded in verifiable evidence. The French pox, despite the immense suffering it caused, was ironically accelerating this crucial intellectual transition, forcing minds to question, to observe, and to innovate. As you booked passage on a merchant vessel bound for Lisbon, you reflected on all you had witnessed and learned in England. Like everywhere else, the epidemic crossed social boundaries with indiscriminate cruelty, yet societal responses often reinforced those very boundaries. Like everywhere, existing institutions adapted rather than fundamentally transformed. And like everywhere, individuals demonstrated remarkable resilience and quiet courage amidst unimaginable suffering. Yet, England's island nature and its distinct social structures had undeniably shaped unique aspects of its response. The localized, parish-based approach to care, the early development of systematic record-keeping under far-sighted physicians like Lineker, and the pragmatic, often intuitive, adaptations of barber surgeons like Master Simons. These differences, subtle but significant, served as a powerful reminder that no epidemic manifests identically across cultures. Local conditions, available resources, and ingrained traditions always profoundly influenced both the impact of the disease and the society's capacity to respond. As your ship prepared to sail with the tide, you stood at the rail, watching London recede, its grand buildings shrinking into the distance. 7 long years had passed since the first major outbreak in Naples, and still the disease maintained its grim, tenacious grip on Europe. Yet, life continued. Commerce flowed, knowledge advanced. Communities, however imperfectly, supported their vulnerable members, and individuals adapted, with extraordinary fortitude, to changed circumstances. The epidemic had become, irrevocably, woven into the very fabric of European society. No longer a shocking novelty, but an established, terrifying feature of the landscape. How it would continue to shape that landscape, medically, socially, intellectually, in the coming decades remained to be seen. Your journey to the Iberian Peninsula, you felt certain, promised new insights into this ongoing, profound transformation. The journey from London to Lisbon took nearly 2 weeks, a relatively swift passage blessed by consistently favorable winds and calm, sparkling seas. Your vessel was a Portuguese carrack, a sturdy, broad-beamed ocean-going ship of the very type that had carried explorers around Africa to India and across the vast Atlantic to the wondrous, terrifying New World. The crew was experienced, having made this voyage countless times, and they regaled the passengers with thrilling tales of distant, exotic lands and strange, unfamiliar peoples. The captain, Duarte Pacheco, a man whose sun-weathered face and piercing eyes spoke of countless horizons, had sailed with some of Portugal's greatest explorers. "I was with Bartolomé Dias when we rounded the Cape of Good Hope," he told you proudly, a glint in his eye. "And I've spoken with men who accompanied Vasco da Gama to India. The world is opening before us, revealing wonders beyond imagination." You, ever curious about the disease's origins, inquired whether he had known Columbus or any who had sailed with him on his momentous voyages. The captain's expression, previously full of open pride, soured slightly, a hint of old rivalry flickering in his eyes. "Columbus sought Portuguese patronage first, you know," he said, a dismissive wave of his hand. "Before turning to Spain. Our king rejected his proposal, wisely, I think, as his calculations of Earth's circumference were wildly mistaken. He found land where he expected India. Yes, but it was mere fortune, not genius, that prevented his expedition's utter failure." This Portuguese perspective on Columbus, somewhat dismissive and emphasizing his errors while grudgingly acknowledging his luck, contrasted sharply with the reverential, almost mythical, treatment he often received in Spain and Italy. It was a potent reminder of how history, you mused, always appears differently depending on who tells the story. As your ship approached the Iberian coast, the landscape underwent a dramatic transformation. The familiar, verdant green fields of northern Europe slowly gave way to the more arid, sun-baked golden hills of the south. The light here was different, clearer, more intense, casting sharper, more defined shadows. The air carried unfamiliar, captivating scents, a dry mix of unfamiliar herbs, the distinct aroma of different cooking spices carried on the breeze, and the unmistakable, earthy fragrance of cork and ancient olive groves. Lisbon revealed itself dramatically as your ship entered the broad, sparkling expanse of the Tagus estuary, a breathtaking city of white buildings climbing steeply up sun-drenched hillsides above the glittering river, crowned by the imposing, ancient Castelo de São Jorge. The harbor itself buzzed with an unprecedented, almost frantic, activity, a testament to Portugal's new maritime dominance. Ships arrived from and departed for Portuguese outposts in Africa, India, and the vast, burgeoning lands of Brazil, carrying exotic spices, glittering gold, precious woods, and other unimaginable treasures that had, almost overnight, made Portugal suddenly wealthy and profoundly powerful. As you disembarked onto the bustling quayside, the vibrant, multinational character of Lisbon became immediately apparent. Portuguese sailors, fresh from arduous voyages, mingled easily with African laborers, their skin glistening in the sun. Jewish merchants, despite official expulsion decades earlier, many having remained by outwardly converting to Christianity, conducted their business with practiced discretion, their eyes sharp with centuries of experience. Moorish craftsmen offered their intricate wares, and visitors from throughout Europe and beyond added to the cosmopolitan throng. The narrow, winding streets rang with the cacophony of multiple languages, and market stalls displayed an astonishing array of goods from 4 continents, a testament to Portugal's global reach. You found lodging in the Alfama district, the oldest and most atmospheric part of the city, where narrow, winding streets, some barely wide enough for a donkey cart, climbed the steep hillside. Your host, Senora Cardoso, was a gentle widow who supported herself by renting out rooms to respectable travelers. Her late husband had been a carpenter who worked on ships for the lucrative East India trade, and their modest, comfortable home was filled with fascinating curiosities he had brought back from his distant voyages. A small, intricately carved ivory figurine from India, a piece of vibrant, patterned silk from Persia, and a dried, curiously shaped seed pod from some far-off tropical land, each a silent testament to the vast, newly interconnected world. Carved ivory, meticulously worked by hands on the African continent, lay beside shimmering, patterned textiles woven in the distant lands of India. Exotic shells, plucked from the sun-drenched shores of unknown archipelagos, completed the array. Senora Cardoso, a woman of sharp intellect and keen observation, deftly guided my gaze across these curiosities, which, much like the objects I'd seen earlier, served as silent, tangible links to a world rapidly shrinking and intertwining. She was proving an invaluable guide, not just to the treasures of global trade, but to Lisbon's unsettling encounter with the French disease. Portuguese physicians, she explained, were among the first to tentatively, then emphatically, connect this new scourge with Columbus's audacious voyages across the Atlantic. It had made its grim debut in Lisbon around 1496, initially clinging to the shadows of the docks, infecting sailors and those who frequented the boisterous waterfront taverns and shadowy brothels. Many, in their initial panic and confusion, had been quick to cast blame upon the nation's burgeoning African and Indian ventures, seeing the disease as a dark byproduct of their global reach. But as the terrifying scale and specific characteristics of the malady became clearer, the insidious link to the Spanish discoveries across the Atlantic became widely, if reluctantly, accepted. The unique tapestry of Portugal's trading empire and its profound historical circumstances profoundly shaped the nation's response to this burgeoning epidemic. As a formidable seafaring power, with a network of colonial outposts stretching across continents, Portugal faced an unparalleled exposure to a diverse array of diseases. Yet, this very global reach also granted it unique access to potential remedies and healing traditions from around the world, a paradoxical advantage. Adding another layer of complexity, the Reconquista, the centuries-long Christian reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula from Islamic rule, had only concluded in 1492. This monumental historical event had bequeathed Portugal a remarkably multicultural medical tradition, a rich synthesis incorporating the knowledge and practices of European, Islamic, and Jewish scholarship. It was through Senora Cardoso's well-placed connections that I found myself introduced to Dr. João Rodrigues, a physician of considerable repute, trained at the prestigious University of Coimbra. He had, I learned, treated countless cases of the dreaded disease among Lisbon's most influential elite, grappling daily with its perplexing symptoms and the fear it instilled. He received me in his consulting room, a space that immediately struck me as a microcosm of the Portuguese Empire itself. Shelves lined the walls, not just with scholarly tomes, but with an astonishing collection of jars, vials, and dried specimens. Here were medicinal substances from every corner of the Portuguese dominion, vibrant green herbs from the lush forests of Brazil, potent minerals extracted from the depths of Africa, and complex botanical preparations, their labels hinting at their origins in India. The air was thick with a melange of exotic scents, a testament to the global reach of his practice. What makes Portuguese medicine truly distinct, Dr. Rodrigues explained, his voice measured and thoughtful, is our global perspective. while physicians in Paris or London, for all their esteemed learning, still primarily rely on the established European and Mediterranean pharmacopoeia, we have been forced, by circumstance and opportunity, to incorporate remedies from Africa, India, and now, most fascinatingly, the Americas. This broader arsenal, he asserted, offers us far more options when confronting novel diseases, maladies that defy the conventional wisdom of the Old World. He went on to describe Portugal's early and pioneering adoption of guaiacum wood from the New World as a primary treatment. Our ships, he recounted, began bringing it directly from Brazil as early as 1498, years before most other European nations even received their first shipments. This gave us a considerable head start, accumulating invaluable experience with its effects. It seems to provide significant relief for many patients, particularly easing the excruciating bone pains and reducing the severity of the skin lesions, though I must confess, it rarely achieves a complete cure. Even more intriguing was his account of integrating traditional remedies from Africa and India into his treatment protocols. From Portugal's West African territories, he revealed, they had obtained powerful herbs that indigenous healers had long utilized for symptoms strikingly similar to those of the French disease. And from India, compounds based on ancient herbs like turmeric and neem were showing considerable promise in reducing inflammation, a persistent and debilitating aspect of the illness. We don't fully understand the precise mechanisms by which these work, he admitted with intellectual humility, but careful, systematic observation in our clinical practice consistently confirms their beneficial effects in many cases. This pragmatic, globally informed approach, he emphasized, represented the very cutting edge of Renaissance medicine, a willingness to boldly experiment with diverse traditions while simultaneously beginning to apply systematic observation to rigorously evaluate outcomes. The Portuguese maritime empire, by its very nature, served as a conduit, bringing together medical knowledge from 4 continents, and thus creating unique and fertile conditions for such groundbreaking innovation. I then inquired about the disease's prevalence and its perception within Portuguese society. Dr. Rodriguez sighed, a sound heavy with the weight of the epidemic. It remains widespread, he confirmed, affecting all social classes, sparing none. Initially, there was indeed much stigma and a great deal of blaming. Foreigners were convenient scapegoats. Africans, Jews, Spanish sailors, all were targeted by fearful tongues. But as respected figures, even members of our most ancient noble families, began to develop the telltale symptoms, public discourse necessarily became more measured, more nuanced. He continued, his gaze distant, as if reliving those early, chaotic days. Our proximity to Spain, where the connection to Columbus's voyages was first proposed, meant this explanation quickly gained early acceptance here. Whether entirely accurate or not, it served a purpose. It shifted blame to distant shores, to exotic lands and intrepid explorers, rather than focusing on local scapegoats. And in doing so, it perhaps, subtly, reduced some of the social strife we might otherwise have seen. During my subsequent time in Lisbon, my observations confirmed the doctor's insights, revealing both striking similarities and significant differences in how various social groups experienced the epidemic compared to other European nations. The nobility and wealthy merchants, as elsewhere, benefited from the discretion of private treatment, their fortunes allowing them to afford the most expensive imported remedies. What truly distinguished their experience here, however, was their early and direct access to novel New World treatments like guaiacum and sarsaparilla, facilitated by Portugal's unparalleled trading connections. The urban middle classes, the diligent guild members, the meticulous government officials, the prosperous shopkeepers, generally followed medical advice similar to their counterparts in Northern Europe, a regimen of moderate living, improved hygiene, and cautious intimacy. Their treatment options represented a hybrid approach, encompassing both traditional European remedies and more affordable, though often less potent, versions of the exotic imports. For the working poor and the city's vast population of sailors, Lisbon offered a network of hospitals, many originally founded during the previous century's devastating plague epidemics, now grimly adapted to treat the new disease. The largest and most prominent was the All Saints Royal Hospital, established by King Joao II in 1492, which even boasted wards specifically designated for those afflicted with the French disease. Treatment there focused on basic care, dietary management, and the application of affordable herbal remedies, a stark contrast to the expensive mercury or imported substances reserved for the wealthy. Yet, the most distinctive and poignant aspect of Lisbon's epidemic experience was undoubtedly its substantial population of African slaves and free black residents, brought from Portuguese colonies in West Africa, the Congo, and Angola. Their experience of the epidemic laid bare the cruel intersection of disease with racial hierarchy and colonialism. When afflicted, enslaved individuals typically received only the most basic treatment, its nature and extent determined less by medical need and more by their economic value to their owners. Free black residents, despite theoretically having equal access to care, faced pervasive discrimination at hospitals and from practitioners, their suffering often marginalized, their pleas for help sometimes ignored. After a revealing 2 weeks in Lisbon, my journey of observation compelled me to continue to Seville, the bustling heart of Spain's American enterprise, and the city most directly connected to the epic-making voyages of Columbus. The overland journey was a tapestry of shifting landscapes, taking me first through Portugal's eastern provinces and then across the border into the sun-baked Spanish region of Andalusia. It was a panorama of ancient olive groves, sprawling vineyards, and formidable fortified hill towns, each structure bearing silent, weathered witness to centuries of frontier warfare between Christian and Islamic states. I traveled with a merchant caravan, a wise choice given the sometimes lawless nature of this borderland. My companions were a motley but engaging group. Portuguese traders, their wagons laden with precious Asian spices destined for Spanish markets. An Italian diplomat, his bearing refined, bound for the glittering Spanish court, and several academics, their minds buzzing with the era's intellectual ferment, on their way to Seville's prestigious university. Around evening fires, under the vast, star-dusted Iberian sky, conversation inevitably turned to the great transformations of the age, the audacious geographical discoveries, the simmering religious tensions, and, always, the mysterious disease that had cast such a long, dark shadow over these very developments. Columbus opened a new world to us, a young Spanish scholar argued passionately one night, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. But perhaps, in doing so, he also unleashed forces we scarcely comprehend. New lands, new peoples, new wealth, and new afflictions. God's design in this, I must confess, remains profoundly obscure. The timing alone, a physician from Coimbra interjected, his voice carrying the authority of his profession, establishes the connection. The disease appeared in Barcelona within mere months of Columbus's return. His sailors, upon landing, made for the brothels, and soon, the first cases emerged precisely in those districts. It is a connection too stark to ignore. The Italian diplomat, ever the voice of nuanced reason, offered a different perspective, carefully weighing his words. And yet, he mused, excavations in my own country, Italy, have uncovered skeletons showing signs of the disease dating from well before Columbus ever set sail. Perhaps, he proposed, it existed in both worlds simultaneously, a dormant seed that only now, with our age of unprecedented movement and upheaval, has found the conditions to truly flourish. These debates, heated yet increasingly informed by a growing body of empirical evidence, exemplified the vibrant intellectual ferment of the early 16th century. Traditional authorities and long-held explanations faced unprecedented challenges from new observations and startling experiences. The epidemic itself, a malady that defied classical medical categories and philosophical interpretations, only accelerated this profound questioning of inherited knowledge. I reached Seville as the summer heat intensified, the mighty Guadalquivir River flowing languidly through the city, providing a welcome, shimmering relief from the oppressive warmth. Seville in 1502 stood undeniably at the very epicenter of Spain's ambitious American enterprise. Every ship bound for, or returning from, the newly claimed territories of the New World had to pass through its bustling port. The Casa de Contratación, or House of Trade, an immensely powerful institution established here that very year, meticulously administered the emerging colonial system, its tentacles reaching across the Atlantic. The city pulsed with an almost feverish activity related to the American ventures. Shipyards clanged with the construction of robust caravels and carracks, designed for the arduous Atlantic crossings. Vast warehouses, their stone walls sweating in the heat, stored an astonishing array of goods bound for the colonies, and, conversely, treasures returned from them: exotic plants, precious metals, and strange new foodstuffs. Officials tirelessly processed the mountain of documentation for passengers and cargo, while adventurers, their eyes alight with dreams of glory and gold, ceaselessly sought backers for their audacious expeditions. Indigenous people, often forcibly brought back by explorers, drew curious, sometimes fearful, crowds, their presence a stark reminder of the human cost of empire. Through the letter of introduction kindly provided by Dr. Rodriguez in Lisbon, I gained access to Dr. Francisco López de Villalobos, physician to the Spanish royal court and the author of what was arguably the first truly detailed medical treatise on the disease published in Spain. I met him at the university, where he occasionally lectured despite his primary, demanding duties to the monarchy. I titled my work, "On the Contagious and Outside Disease of the French," he told me with a dry, knowing smile, following the lamentable custom of naming it after one's traditional enemies. But, he paused, his expression turning serious, "I believe we Spaniards must accept some measure of responsibility for its presence in Europe, if indeed it truly came from Hispaniola with Columbus's men." Dr. de Villalobos represented the finest medical thinking of Renaissance Spain, a rare synthesis of traditional Galenic training, deep humanist learning, and a rigorous commitment to practical observation. His treatise, published in 1498, had provided the first comprehensive clinical description of the disease in Spanish, including meticulous observations of its progression through distinct, horrifying stages. "What truly distinguishes this malady from those previously known," he explained, "is its perplexing pattern of remission and recurrence. The initial symptoms, often quite severe, can resolve completely without any treatment, giving false hope of recovery. Then, weeks or even months later, new and vastly different manifestations appear, often more insidious, more debilitating. This unpredictable pattern confounded our understanding for a long time, until we began the arduous but necessary task of recording detailed case histories over extended periods. Only then did the cyclical nature of its ravages begin to emerge. I inquired about the treatments employed in Spain, where proximity to the source of Guaiacum might logically provide certain advantages. Dr. de Villalobos sighed, a familiar weariness in his expression. "Guaiacum has indeed been our primary recourse," he acknowledged, "especially after mercury, which was initially favored, so often showed such dangerous and devastating side effects. But while it undoubtedly alleviates symptoms for many patients, few, I regret to say, experience a complete and lasting recovery. Some physicians, myself included, are now exploring combined approaches, moderate mercury treatments, carefully administered, alternating with guaiacum decoctions and meticulously controlled dietary regimens." Most valuable, however, was his personal perspective on Columbus's direct role in the epidemic. "I have personally interviewed several physicians who treated Columbus's crew upon their return," he revealed. "They confirmed that some sailors developed symptoms entirely consistent with the disease shortly after reaching Spain. Whether they contracted it in the Indies and brought it back, or if they carried it from Spain to the Indies and then it mutated or flourished upon their return, remains a vigorously debated question." He continued, his voice lowering with a touch of melancholy. Columbus himself suffered from a painful, progressive illness in his later years that some believe was the French disease, though others attribute it to gout or arthritis, which were also common and debilitating. He died just 4 years ago, his great discovery, it seems, having brought him far more grief than glory in the end. During my prolonged stay in Seville, I was granted a rare privilege: access to documents and even individuals directly connected to Columbus's epic-making voyages. At the Casa de Contratación, the newly established archives housed an astonishing collection of logs, correspondence, and official reports from the earliest expeditions. Though these were jealously guarded as state secrets, Dr. de Villalobos's considerable connections allowed me limited access to these invaluable materials. The logs, to my frustration, mentioned health problems among crew members during and after the voyages, but the descriptions were often vague, frustratingly lacking in specificity. More revealing, however, were personal letters from participants, penned after their return, desperately seeking medical care and describing symptoms clearly recognizable, even to my modern eye, as those of the French disease. Yet, even these poignant accounts left the crucial question unanswered: whether they had contracted the illness in the Americas or after returning to Spain's bustling port cities remained tantalizingly unclear. I also had the singular opportunity to meet Rodrigo Pérez, an elderly man who claimed, with a glint in his eye, to have sailed on Columbus's first voyage. Now living in modest, almost forgotten circumstances despite his historic role, he received visitors occasionally, willing to share his experiences for a few coins. Whether his tales were entirely truthful or embellished by time and the desire to entertain, they nevertheless provided a rare, first-hand perspective on the expedition's aftermath, a raw, human counterpoint to the official narratives. Many of my shipmates fell ill in the months after our return, he told me, sipping the rough wine his fee had purchased, his voice raspy with age and memory. Some with fevers that passed quickly, others with persistent ailments, including the dreaded pox. I was fortunate to escape the worst of it, though aches still visit my bones when the weather changes, a ghost of that time. He vividly described the primitive medical practices he had observed among the indigenous Caribbean peoples, some of which, out of sheer desperation, were adopted by the early European settlers. They used the bark and leaves of certain trees to make infusions for skin ailments, he recalled. Some of the colonists, when our own remedies failed, found these to be more effective. Eventually, these very treatments, refined and commercialized, found their way back to Spain as the guaiacum wood, now sold at such exorbitant prices. As summer gracefully ceded to autumn, I extended my stay in Spain, traveling to other vital cities, including Salamanca, with its famed university, a beacon of Renaissance learning, and Barcelona, the grand port city where Columbus had been received by Ferdinand and Isabella upon his triumphant return. Throughout these journeys, I observed a profound transformation. The epidemic, once a terrifying, bewildering novelty, had become integrated into the fabric of Spanish society. It was no longer an acute crisis, but an established, albeit unwelcome, feature of the medical and social landscape. By 1502, a mere 7 years after the first major European outbreak, the disease had transitioned from an acute epidemic to a chronic endemic presence. The initial wave of panic had largely subsided, replaced by a more systematic, albeit weary, process of adaptation. Medical protocols, though still largely ineffective in achieving a true cure, had become standardized. Social responses, ranging from dedicated hospital wards to rudimentary preventive regulations, had been institutionalized. Even religious interpretations had evolved, shifting from seeing the disease as an unprecedented, direct divine punishment to incorporating it into existing frameworks of sin and redemption, making it, in a grim sense, more comprehensible. As winter's chill began to sharpen the air, I prepared for my return journey. My extensive travels through much of Western Europe, meticulously observing the epidemic's impact and the evolving responses, had been profoundly illuminating. My experiences in the Iberian Peninsula, however, had provided a truly crucial perspective on the disease's possible origins and earliest European manifestations, perfectly complementing my earlier observations from Italy, Germany, France, and England. Before departing, I visited the magnificent Seville Cathedral, a colossal edifice still under construction, its grandeur a testament to Spanish imperial ambition. It was here that Columbus's son, Diego, would eventually be interred, though Columbus himself would be buried in Valladolid, then moved multiple times in death, much as he had been restless in life. The massive structure, built atop the ruins of a mosque demolished following the Christian reconquest, powerfully symbolized the transformative era I had witnessed, a world simultaneously expanding through audacious exploration and, paradoxically, contracting through shared afflictions. The long journey home, across the restless seas, afforded me ample time to reflect deeply on all I had observed about how societies, across diverse cultures and political systems, respond to the relentless challenge of epidemic disease. Certain patterns, I realized, had emerged with remarkable consistency. Initially, communities inevitably react with fear, a primal emotion that drives an urgent need to identify causes and, crucially, assign blame. This blame is almost invariably directed at marginalized groups or external enemies. This scapegoating, while providing a fleeting psychological comfort, tragically hinders an effective response, diverting energy and obscuring true understanding. As understanding slowly grows, practical adaptations begin to develop. Modified social behaviors, rudimentary public health measures, and evolving treatment protocols emerge. These evolve through a painstaking process of trial and error, gradually, incrementally, improving outcomes, even without a complete theoretical understanding of the underlying disease mechanisms. Social hierarchies, I noted with a heavy heart, profoundly shape both vulnerability to disease and access to care. The privileged suffer less, not from any biological immunity, but from their superior resources, better living conditions, and access to more sophisticated, or at least more expensive, treatment options. The vulnerable, conversely, suffer disproportionately, their afflictions often less visible, less documented in the grand narratives of history. Religious and moral frameworks, in the early stages of an epidemic, initially interpret new diseases as divine punishment, frequently for perceived sexual transgressions. Over time, however, these harsh judgments typically soften, especially as respected community members, even those of unquestionable piety, fall ill. As practical care becomes more organized and humane, compassion begins to temper condemnation. Medical understanding, I observed, advances through empirical observation, often challenging and eventually overturning traditional authorities. Epidemic diseases, particularly those that defy classical explanations, accelerate this process, pushing practitioners toward more evidence-based approaches, a nascent scientific method born of necessity. Throughout all this, human resilience manifests in countless forms. Communities supporting afflicted members, dedicated practitioners developing new treatments, and individuals modifying their behaviors to reduce risk while still maintaining necessary activities. As my ship sailed homeward, marking the changing seasons, I pondered how these deeply ingrained patterns might repeat with future epidemics. Perhaps centuries hence, new, unforeseen diseases will emerge to challenge human understanding and institutions anew. Will societies, I wondered, respond with greater wisdom, having learned from the hard-won experiences like that of the French disease? Or will they, in their fear and confusion, merely repeat cycles of denial, blame, and stumbling adaptation before finally finding effective responses? I now knew, with a sobering certainty, that the disease labeled variously as French, Neapolitan, Spanish, or simply the Great Pox, would continue its devastating course for centuries to come. Not until 1905 would the causative organism, Treponema pallidum, be definitively identified. Not until the 1940s would truly effective antibiotic treatment become widely available. Countless lives would be tragically affected in the intervening centuries. Some ended prematurely, others lived in protracted suffering, still others shaped profoundly by the harrowing task of caring for the afflicted or laboring to develop elusive treatments. The passionate debate over the disease's origins, too, would continue to rage for generations. Archaeological evidence, increasingly unearthed from both Europe and the Americas, has complicated the seemingly straightforward Columbus connection, suggesting far more complex patterns of development and transmission than a simple importation from one continent to another. Indeed, the mutation of related treponemal diseases from non-venereal to venereal forms may well have occurred independently in multiple locations as social conditions and human behaviors changed. What remains unequivocally clear, however, from both historical accounts and modern scientific understanding, is how profoundly epidemic diseases shape human societies, not just through direct suffering and death, but through transformed social relations, radical institutional responses, accelerated medical developments, and nuanced cultural expressions. The French disease permanently altered European perspectives on sexuality, irrevocably reshaped approaches to public health, spurred the development of hospitals, and touched countless other social dimensions. As my journey concluded, I carried with me this deeper, more holistic understanding of how humans and diseases co-evolve, each shaping the other through a complex, often brutal, interplay. The syphilis epidemic of Renaissance Europe, for all its suffering, ultimately contributed to significant medical advances, spurred institutional development, and forced social adaptations that would eventually, over centuries, reduce its most devastating impact. This profound pattern, crisis driving innovation, suffering spurring response, offers perhaps the most hopeful perspective on humanity's ongoing, relentless struggle with infectious disease. The story of any epidemic, I reflected, is ultimately the story of human vulnerability and human resilience. Our bodies, fragile and susceptible to invisible organisms. Our societies, surprisingly capable of remarkable adaptation and ingenuity. From the French disease of 1495 to modern outbreaks, this fundamental dynamic remains constant. We are simultaneously fragile biological beings and creators of knowledge and institutions that expand our collective capacity to survive and to thrive. Despite that inherent fragility, this tension between human vulnerability and human ingenuity continues to define our relationship with disease. As we face new epidemics, we invariably draw on accumulated knowledge and institutional memory from past crises. Yet, with disheartening regularity, we often repeat historical patterns of initial denial, scapegoating, and unequal impact before developing truly effective responses. Understanding this complex history doesn't prevent all future suffering, but it does illuminate paths toward more rapid, more equitable, and ultimately more humane adaptation. And so, as I finally returned home, changed irrevocably by all I had witnessed across epidemic-stricken Europe, I carried both the sobering knowledge of human suffering and the inspiring examples of human resilience. The French disease, like all great epidemics, reveals both the worst and the best of humanity. Our chilling capacity for fear, blame, and cruelty alongside our boundless capacity for care, adaptation, and healing. This complex legacy, I realized, continues to shape our world today, subtly visible to those who know where to look for its lingering influences.